Night deepens, and a vision of fire shakes the company. From the white city burning to a path only the dead still guard, destiny calls them forward. Tonight, we walk softly through halls of shadow and across fields where hope and sorrow meet. Chapter 6. Legolas finished carving his arrows and put them all in his quiver. He placed the quiver back on his back and stood up. The night air still rang with the fears of the Rohan people, but there was a small layer of hope as well. Hope would have to be enough to get them through the night. Hope he should have. He sighed and headed back into the armory. Now would be a good time to apologize to Aragorn. He found Aragorn in the armory, putting on his armor. He watched for a second before stepping forward. He stepped beside Aragorn and picked up the man's sword. Aragorn turned to reach for it before realizing Legolas stood next to him. He glanced up. Legolas held out the sword, and the man took it. I have trusted you this far, and you, who did not know me long, have put your trust in me. You have not led me astray. Forgive me. I was wrong to despair during a time when the men need hope and not discouragement. Aragorn smiled at him and placed a hand on his shoulder. Umoe Edmund, Legolas. There is nothing to forgive, Legolas. Legolas smiled back at him, glad to have his forgiveness. They both turned as Gimli waddled into the room. He was trying to put on a chainmail armor, but struggled to push it over his chest. If we had time, I'd get this adjusted, he muttered before he was able to push it over his chest. The chainmail fell to the ground, and Legolas eyed the extra length in amusement. Gimli glanced up. It's a little tight across the chest, he said. Legolas and Aragorn eyed each other in amusement before giving the dwarf a smile. Legolas opened his mouth to make some comment about Gimli's short stature when a loud horn was heard from outside. Legolas whipped his head up, his eyes narrowing. That is no orc horn, he said. He exchanged confused looks with Aragorn before rushing out of the armory, leaving Gimli behind to deal with his little problem. Open the gate! Legolas heard faintly from outside. They're opening the gate, he informed Aragorn. When they paused briefly to let Gimli catch up, they exchanged curious looks. Who would be arriving? They did not send riders out for aid. Gimli finally came huffing up the stairs. His chainmail was off, and his hair was muddled from his rush to lift it over his head. Come, Gimli, Aragorn called out before beginning his ascent up the steps. Legolas followed after him, with Gimli behind him. They quickly exit into the night air. Legolas paused as he saw what was before them. There was an army of elves. Legolas stared almost drunkenly at the sight of his kin. Never had he been this close to his own race. They looked as graceful and deadly as he heard. They stood tall and confident in their armor and weapons. They were just what the people of Rohan needed to fight this battle. He felt hope and nerves flare into him. He quickly followed Aragorn down the steps as his heart pounded nervously in his chest. Never having been this close to his own kind before made him unnerved, separated from them, his own kin. It was a discouraging feeling. However, their presence brought brighter hope inside him at the same time. Elves, he heard, were mighty warriors. We come to honor that allegiance, the leader of the militia of elves said to the king as he lifted his eyes to Aragorn. He had sea-blue eyes and long silver hair that was pulled back away from his face in a partial braid. His body was tall and lean, like most elves. May Govanen, Haldir, Aragorn greeted. Welcome. He made a move to bow, but paused. Instead, he pulled the elf, Haldir, he called him, into a hug. Legolas caught the slight surprised raise of the elf's brow as he carefully returned the gesture. Haldir lifted his eyes and caught sight of Legolas. He seemed to freeze. A flicker of an unidentified emotion crossed his eyes before Aragorn pulled away from him, blocking his sight of Legolas. The look made Legolas feel uncomfortable. It had almost looked like the elf recognized him. "You are most welcome," Aragorn said. He stepped aside, and Legolas moved to stand next to the man. Haldir's gaze seemed to find him again, and Legolas fought the urge to shift uncomfortably at the intensity of his look. Haldir's eyes were narrowed, and it gave him a feeling of being scrutinized. The army of elves suddenly turned to face them and lower their bows and shields in unison. Legolas looked away from the lead elf to glance at the hundreds of elven warriors. Graceful, quick, and dangerous. He felt oddly uncomfortable, as if eyes were on him. Was it just him, or did the other elves give him the same look Haldir had? He shook it off as paranoia and nerves of being so close to his own kin, and turned back to Haldir. The elf still watched him, his eyes not missing anything. He inwardly sighed in relief when the other elf's gaze moved back to the king. "We are proud to fight alongside men once more," he told Theoden. His eyes, once again, briefly flickered back to Legolas before settling firmly on the king. Haldir walked alongside Aragorn, placing his warriors along the battlement. He glanced around at his warriors, seeing if they were all in place. His gaze fell upon the familiar-looking elf that traveled with Aragorn. The elf was eyeing the elves around him. He didn't look entirely comfortable, whether it was because of the upcoming battle, the dwarf, or being around his own kin. Haldir couldn't say. The dwarf stood next to him, but with his height, he was barely noticeable. "Aragorn," he said softly, grabbing the man's attention. He kept his eyes on the lone elf. He felt Aragorn turn to him. "Yes, Haldir?" "Ja, Natanya," Haldir asked, nodding towards the elf. "Who is that?" Aragorn leaned forward and stared at the elf as well. "I'm sorry we didn't give time for introductions," he responded in Elvish. "But that is Legolas." Haldir's jaw tightened at the name, recognizing it right away. Aragorn didn't seem to notice. His gaze was fixed on the said elf. "Gimli and I met him in Fangorn Forest. Gandalf had him come along," he answered, once again in the language of the elves. Haldir's eyes flickered to Aragorn briefly. He wasn't surprised the man didn't recognize the name. He would have heard of him only by title, possibly not by name, and only in passing. "Mani umli sinten ho?" he asked. "What do you know of him?" Aragorn gave him a look. "Mankoi liu tune?" "Why do you ask?" Haldir gave him a look. "Nar Annam." "Tell me." Aragorn glanced over at Legolas and shook his head. "He doesn't even know." He answered quietly in Elvish. He has been searching for answers to that question for a long time now. I suspect he is from Mirkwood, by the markings on his arrows. Why the interest? Haldir ignored his question and stared at the elf in question. Legolas. Had he finally been found after all these years? It had to be him. He looked very much like his father. "Captain Carnzir," he called out to one of his warriors. He felt Aragorn's questioning eyes on him, but continued to ignore him. An elf stepped out of position and stood tall before him. "I will not be long. Keep watch in my absence," Haldir ordered before turning and leaving the battlement. "Haldir, Haldir," Aragorn called out to him, but didn't follow. Under the dim light of a candle, Haldir passively put down the quill and read what he wrote silently. Satisfied, he placed the letter into the envelope and sealed it with dark red wax, finishing it off with a press of his ring, the mark of the Marchwarden of Lothlorien. He stood and blew out the candle. He kept the letter in his hands as he returned quickly to the battlement, passing confused and frightened soldiers. He reached the battlement and immediately searched out Aragorn. "Aragorn," he called out for his attention. The man paused and turned to him. "There you are, Haldir. They have arrived," he said, pointing into the horizon. Haldir barely gave the black mass in the horizon a glance. He was surprised Aragorn was able to spot them through darkened sky, his with human eyes. He leaned close to the man and held up the sealed letter. "Take this," he said urgently in Elvish. "If I survive the night, return it to me. If not, order a surviving elf to take this straight to King Thranduil of the Greenwood Realm with great haste." Confused, Aragorn reached up to take the letter, but Haldir didn't let it go right away. He gave Aragorn a serious look. "This is important, Aragorn. Tell the elf to hand-deliver it to the king. He must receive it. The elf must not trust this in any other hand. It is for the king's eyes only. What he does with this information is up to him, but he must be the first to read it. Do you understand?" he asked. Aragorn had immediately sensed the importance of the letter, but it took a second longer to figure out what or who it was about. "It's about Legolas, isn't it, Haldir? You had left as soon as I told you what I knew of him." His eyes lit up as something came to him. "You know who he is, don't you, my friend? He must be of great importance to involve the king." Haldir let go of the letter and looked over at the horizon. "Now is not the time to discuss this. After the battle, we shall talk." He glanced back at Aragorn. "Just make sure someone will personally deliver it to King Thranduil." Aragorn placed the note in his tunic and nodded. "Lagarnin Peth, you have my word." He didn't even question the possibility that he might die this night. "Nila Sui." "Thank you." Haldir left Aragorn to get into his position. Aragorn came up behind Legolas and Gimli. Before he had a chance to speak, Gimli opened his mouth. "Well, lad, the luck you live by. Let's hope it lasts the night." There was a flash of lightning across the dark sky and a clash of thunder. The momentary light from the lightning showed the dark mass of Uruk-hai stretched to the horizon. "We are with you, Aragorn," Legolas said. He turned his head to look him in the eye. "I am with you," he confirmed, letting the man know he wasn't going to leave his side, for whatever reason. Aragorn returned his conviction with a nod, as Gimli grumbled under his breath, "Let's hope we last the night." They glanced up at the first fall of the rain. "This won't make the battle any more pleasant," Gimli muttered in displeasure as the clouds released the heavy waters from their grasp. Saruman's troops walked forward, carrying torches and long spears. Their march sent the men quivering in fear. Legolas was able to taste it in the air, and he couldn't blame them. The army was large and intimidating. Their evil hearts gave Legolas a cold feeling deep inside him. Aragorn gave both of them a reassuring pat on the shoulder before walking away. Eruchin udano I phalas ahin, and ubentanatha lephalas. Show them no mercy, for you shall receive none." Legolas heard him shout to the elvish army. The Uruk-hai stopped their advance and stood there. "What is happening out there, elf?" Gimli asked. Legolas fought the urge to roll his eyes, an act he found too childish and human. "I really wish you would stop calling me an elf as if it is an insult." He glanced down at him. "I happen to enjoy being an elf, and do not find it in the least insulting. It is much better than being a dwarf." Gimli glared at him and muttered incoherent under his breath. He turned away. "I can't believe I'm fighting alongside a pointy-eared elf." Legolas sighed. "Then how about fighting alongside a friend? Are you able to do that?" he asked softly. Gimli glanced up at him in surprise. He blinked and nodded slowly. "Aye," he said with a hint of a smile. "I can do that." The Uruks started to pound their weapons against the ground and roar. Legolas, along with everyone else, prepared his weapon, placing the first arrow onto the string of his bow. He pulled back and waited for the command to fire. From out of nowhere, an arrow whizzed into the night and landed into the neck of an Uruk-hai. Legolas blinked in surprise at the sudden attack, as did most. There was a silence in the air as the Uruk fell to the ground. "Dartho!" he heard Aragorn call out. "Hold!" The Uruks roared out in anger and charged forward. Legolas pulled back his arrow and waited for Aragorn's command. He didn't have to wait long. "Lethio I Falin, fire!" Legolas shot his first arrow of the battle, feeling the wind as other arrows followed from all around him. Most of the arrows hit their target, but, expectedly, the Uruk didn't stop their charge. "Fire!" he heard Gamling call out. More arrows came shooting forth, more clumsily. Some managed to hit their target. "Tangado a Chadad!" Aragorn shouted. "Keep firing! Come on! Come on!" Gimli muttered impatiently. "Send them to me." He held out his axe, anxiously ready to fight. Legolas continued to shoot despite the arrows firing back at him. He felt many whiz past him, going in both directions. A few elves and man fell from the wall. There was a movement below, and Legolas' eyes widened when he caught sight of it. The Uruks had ladders. "Pendraid!" Aragorn yelled. "Ladders!" "Ladders!" Legolas translated for Gimli as he fired more arrows at the climbing Uruk-hai. The dwarf nodded. "Good!" he exclaimed as he tightened his grip on his axe. When the Uruk made it to the top, the heavy fighting followed. Legolas quickly stepped aside to allow room to string his arrows. Gimli began, gleefully, swinging his axe into the flesh of the Uruks. Legolas quickly lost track of him as more Uruks invaded the wall. To save on his arrows, Legolas gracefully put his bow on his back and took out his sword. An Uruk came right at him with its sword raised. Legolas quickly blocked the attack and managed to stab him in the gut. Black blood fell to the stone ground. There was a roar, and another Uruk rushed forward to attack. Legolas dodged to the side and stabbed the Uruk in the back before swinging quickly around to block another attack. The attack pushed him back, and he bumped into someone behind him. Not caring who he bumped into, he kicked the Uruk away from him and advanced forward to stab him in the gut. Another Uruk was running at him, and Legolas placed his sword away and grabbed his bow. He managed to shoot the Uruk before it was able to attack. "Northway! Nothanen!" Aragorn shouted from somewhere far. Legolas didn't have time to look, as another Uruk rushed forward. He managed to kill the Uruk before rushing to the ledge, just as Aragorn began shouting for him. "Togohun, Dad, Legolas! Dagohun! Legolas, stop him! Kill him!" It only took a second for Legolas to see the issue. Below him, a group of Uruks were giving path to a single Uruk soldier carrying a bright torch. The Uruk was running towards a small hole in the wall, the drainage system. Legolas fired an arrow, but the Uruk barely filched at the contact. He fired another one, but that, too, failed to bring the Uruk down. His heart began pounding as he realized he wouldn't be able to stop it. The Uruk dived into the hole, and it was followed by a huge explosion. Pieces of the stone wall flew into the air. There were screams all around him as men and elves were flung about. Legolas dived down and covered his head as debris fell around him. The whole walled structure seemed to shake at the magnitude of the explosion. There was a mighty, satisfied roar from the Uruk. "Aragorn!" Legolas shouted with realization. The man had been right there at the explosion. He rushed to the ledge and saw a mass number of Uruk running in through the break in the wall. He rushed to the staircase shooting arrows at any Uruk he spotted. He was close to the stairs when he heard, with relief, Aragorn. "Hirio!" the man shouted. "Charge!" A quick glance was all he needed to see the elvish warriors charging at the Uruk with Aragorn in the lead. Without pause, Legolas flipped a fallen shield into his hands and threw it onto the steps of the stairs. He jumped on and rode down, shooting arrows at the Uruks, flowing in from the hole until he reached the bottom. He fired a few more shots before taking out his trusty daggers. He ducked as a dark blade flew at his neck. He quickly pushed his dagger upward and into the Uruk's gut. The fighting continued, and Legolas could tell that the men were getting tired by the way their attacks slowed and their labored breathing. "Aragorn!" King Theoden shouted. "Fall back to the keep. Get your men out of there." "Am Marad," Aragorn commanded. "To the keep." Legolas started to fall back, following everyone to the keep, when he noticed Gimli still vibrantly fighting. "Gimli!" he called out. "Fall back!" "Not until these mindless beasts fall to my axe," Gimli shouted back. Legolas grabbed hold to the forearm of a passing elf warrior. "Help me get him, or he'll get himself killed." The elf glanced at the dwarf and nodded. Legolas, with the unknown elf by his side, dashed forward to pull Gimli away. They grabbed each of Gimli's arms and lifted up. "Hey!" Gimli protested as they started to drag him back to the keep. "What are you doing? Stop it!" The two elves didn't put him down until they got inside the keep. Gimli shrugged off their hands and glared. "What was that for, you pointy-eared elf?" Legolas ignored him and turned to the other elf. "Hanan Leh," he said with a nod. "Thank you." The other elf nodded in return before taking his leave. Legolas turned back to Gimli. "I'm heading above, if Aragorn asks." He turned and left before Gimli could insult him further. He quickly pushed past the rushing men to get to the steps. He rushed up the steps to join his fellow kin in their archery. A few moments later, he noticed 2 more ladders getting pulled up to the wall. One each ladder there was over a dozen Uruks holding onto it. He noticed the rope that held the ladders. He pulled back his bow and fired the chain. It fell, crushing some of the Uruks below. Below him, he noticed Aragorn and Gimli on the causeway, battling the Uruks and keeping them from the door. He couldn't see how they would get away. He turned from the sight and glanced around him. "A rope," he ordered, to no one in particular. "I need rope." A few seconds later, an elf rushed up to him, holding rope. "Rope, as you ordered." He held it out for Legolas. Legolas took it from him and leaned over the wall. "Aragorn!" he yelled down to the man. Aragorn glanced up, and he threw the rope down. As soon as Aragorn and Gimli were securely holding the rope, Legolas began to pull them up. "Ni Selmatua," an elf said as he stepped forward to help Legolas pull them up. "I will help." Together, they were able to pull Aragorn and Gimli to the top. "Hanan Leh, Legolas," Aragorn said as he patted the elf's shoulder with thankfulness. "Thank you." He nodded towards the other elf to show his gratitude. "Come, that barrier on the door won't last the night." Aragorn rushed to the steps, calling over his shoulders. "Come, Gimli." The dwarf huffed and rushed after him, complaining incoherently about something under his breath. Legolas went after them to help. The hours since the start of the battle seemed to drag once they were boarded up inside Fort Eorlingus. The past few hours were spent running back and forth from the door to the diminishing woodpile. The men were exhausted and hungry, but couldn't stop to rest, not with the enemy trying to break through the inner doors. Legolas's ears rang with the consistent banging at the doors. He followed Aragorn to the pile to pick up another beam as King Theoden spoke. "The fortress is taken. It is over," he said, sounding defeated and tired. Gimli stood next to him, looking just as tired. Aragorn and Legolas paused briefly. The man turned to him and nodded him to continue. Legolas reached down and carried the beam to the door as the man turned to the king. "You said this fortress would never fall while your men defended. They still defend it. They have died defending it," he shouted. Legolas helped the men prop the beam firmly against the doors, just as the doors shook with the force of the Uruks on the other side. "Is there no other way for the women and children to get out of the caves?" he heard Aragorn asked. Legolas glanced back at them when he heard no answer. "Is there no other way?" Aragorn demanded, taking a step towards them. The king turned away. Legolas made his way over to them as Gimli answered. "There is one passage. It leads into the mountains, but they will not get far. The Uruk-hai are too many. It's better than having them wait for the never-waking darkness of death." Legolas intruded. "It gives them a chance. It gives them hope." Aragorn nodded in agreement. "Send word for the women and children to make for the mountain pass," he ordered, "and barricade the entrance." He shoved Gimli towards the exit. The man nodded and left in haste. "So much death," King Theoden suddenly said. Aragorn and Legolas turned to him. "What can men do against such reckless hate?" They all turned to the door when there was a loud bang as the Uruk tried to break it down. "Ride out with me," Aragorn said. Legolas snapped his head towards him, wondering if he was being serious. But he could tell in his expression he was. Theoden turned to face the other man, a curious expression on his face. "Ride out and meet them," Aragorn continued to say. "For death and glory?" the Rohan king asked. Aragorn took a step forward. "For Rohan, for your people," Gimli approached them. "The sun is rising," he said softly. Legolas glanced out the window, and his blue eyes met with the first rays of the waking Sunday. "The 5th day," he muttered quietly. "Gandalf." He turned to Aragorn, but the man wasn't paying him any attention. He was staring at the sun's rays as well. "Yes, yes," King Theoden said, not noticing their momentarily distractedness. "The horn of Helm Hammerhand shall sound in the deep one last time." "Yes," Gimli shouted in glee. King Theoden turned to him. "Go, Master Gimli. Blow the horn with your mighty lungs. Let those foul and retching creatures know we are not bowing down without a fight." Gimli nodded and headed up the stairs to blow the horn of Helm Hammerhand. The king turned towards Aragorn and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let this be the hour when we draw swords together." Aragorn nodded, and Theoden removed his hand. "Fell deeds awake. Now for wrath, now for ruin, and the red dawn," he exclaimed. The strength in his voice gave the men around them strength as well. They shouted with zeal and the ever-surprising courage of men. "Ready the horses and swords," the king ordered. There was a sudden rush of movement as every Solitaire quickly followed the orders. It didn't take long for everyone to get on their horses behind the king. They waited patiently to hear the mighty horn. The Uruks hadn't stopped their attempt at getting in. The doors were growing weak now, with no one there to keep putting beams and boards up. Finally, the sound of the blowing horn echoed around them just as the doors give in. "For the Eorlingas!" King Theoden shouted before charging forward. Everyone followed right behind. The Uruk stumbled back in surprise as the horses plowed into them. Gimli continued to blow the horn as the fight started. Legolas reached down with his sword to smite the creatures as he followed everyone down the causeway. They made it quickly down the causeway, hacking at any Uruk in their path. Legolas was so into his fight, he almost didn't hear Aragorn's quiet whisper. "Gandalf." Legolas glanced up and saw the white figure on top of a white horse on the hill. Hope bloomed into his heart at the sight of the wizard. The battle paused as the Uruk glanced at Gandalf as well. A figure clad in armor rode up alongside Gandalf. The man drew his sword and gave a mighty shout. "Rohirrim!" He raised his sword into the air. The earth pounded with horses as they appeared beside the two. "Éomer!" King Theoden exclaimed. "To the king!" The man Éomer shouted. Gandalf and the Rohirrim charged down the hill towards the Uruk-hai. The Uruk-hai got into a line and pointed their spears at them, but they were blinded by the rising sun and Gandalf's staff. The two sides clashed into one another, and the battle began anew. The battle didn't last as long with the added troops. They soon sent the Uruks fleeing from Helm's Deep with fear. The men shouted in victory as they gave chase. The Uruk headed for a line of trees. Éomer paused and yelled, "Stay out of the forest. Keep away from the trees." The rest of the men stopped and watched the Uruk enter. Legolas felt the anger of the trees increase as each Uruk entered the forest. The trees groaned and swayed. Horrible sounds emerged as the trees moved to crush the Uruk. Legolas could feel the trees' satisfaction at killing the beasts. The battle at Helm's Deep was completely over now. Almost an hour later, everyone was helping to clear away the bodies. Legolas walked through the mess and spotted Gimli sitting on an Uruk body, smoking his pipe. The elf went up to him to encourage him to help with the cleanup. But before he could speak, Gimli spoke up. "Final count, 43. Legolas blinked in confusion. "Pardon? Aye, my count is 43. What is yours, elf?" Gimli grumbled. Legolas stared at him, not comprehending. "I am not understanding your meaning." "Kills," Gimli snapped. 43 kills. How many for you?" Legolas shook his head. "I do not know. I wasn't aware I needed to count, but I am sure it was more than 43. Gimli waved his comment off to the side. "No guessing. I won by default." He grinned and blew out a puff of smoke. "Next time, you should keep count." Legolas just shook his head and walked away, no longer caring the dwarf wasn't helping. Aragorn stared down at Haldir's lifeless body. He would grieve the elf's passing. He had always been a good friend to him. He thought back to the March Warden's last moment. "Haldir!" Aragorn wrapped his arms around the falling body of his friend. The battle raged on around him, but his focus was on Haldir. "Haldir," he muttered with grief. The elf's eyes gazed up at the smoke-filled sky, as if he saw something the man couldn't see. He slowly moved his eyes to Aragorn. His mouth moved, but no words came out. Aragorn shook his head. "What is it, Haldir?" he asked softly. He leaned his head down to hear. "Make Suri he lives." Legolas. Aragorn glanced over and saw Legolas walking over bodies, shaking his head. "Who are you, my friend?" he asked softly to himself. He sighed forlornly as he reached into his pocket and took out the letter Haldir had handed him right before the battle. He knew the answer to Legolas's identity may lay concealed in the letter. It was almost tempting to open it, but he shouldn't. It was not meant for his eyes. He glanced around and saw the surviving elves gathering around their dead to take them back to Lothlorien. It was now his duty to find an elf to take the letter to the King of Mirkwood. He grabbed the first elf that was passing him. The elf glanced at him in surprise. "Lord Aragorn," he greeted. "You wish to speak to me?" he asked in Elvish. Aragorn nodded and pulled them to the side as other elves picked up Haldir's body with careful reverence. He turned back to the elf. "What is your name?" he asked. "I'm Captain Carnassir. Captain Carnassir, I have an important duty to bestow upon you on the behalf of Haldir." Carnassir stood in attention at the name of his fallen leader. His eyes shined with determination. "Anything, Lord Aragorn." Aragorn held up the letter. "This goes directly to King Thranduil. No other could read this before him. Haldir wants you to make sure the king gets this and reads it. I want you to make haste to the woodland realm, but do not engage in battle unless necessary. This is too important for you to die on the way there. Go around the enemy if you must. Do you understand, Captain?" The elf nodded and took the letter from him. He placed it in his pocket. "I shall leave right away." Aragorn nodded and watched as the elf left to prepare for his long journey to the Greenwood realm. Later, they all sat on their horses, looking towards Mordor. "Sauron's wrath will be terrible, his retribution swift," Gandalf said, as he eyed the fiery smokes of Mordor rising up into the dark sky. "The battle for Helm's Deep is over. The battle for Middle-earth is about to begin. All our hopes now lie with two little hobbits, somewhere in the wilderness." Legolas nodded to himself, promising once again that he would stand by Aragorn and the others until the very end. Only then shall he make his way to the Greenwood realm to find out where he belongs. Chapter 7. Thranduil walked along the battlement, staring in the forest. There hadn't been an attack from the orcs in weeks. It got him anxious. The spiders were still a problem. They haven't decreased in their numbers of attacks, but they haven't increased it either. "My liege." Thranduil turned. A messenger elf stood behind him. The elf bowed. "Yes?" he asked. "There is a letter from Lord Elrond of Rivendell for you, my king." The elf held out a sealed letter. Thranduil sighed inwardly as he took the letter. He gave a nod of gratitude to the elf before turning his back. He stared at the letter before opening it. He could already imagine what Lord Elrond wanted. This would be the third letter about this topic. He sighed as he read. The beginning was exactly what he expected, but surprisingly, Lord Elrond shared a vision of the future with him, hoping it would make him decide to lead his people to the sea. "I believe you remember hearing of my adopted mortal son, Estel. You are already informed of his true heritage and would not bore you of it. In the near future, he would lead the armies of Gondor and Rohan to the Black Gates. It would be the final battle of this dark war. If he succeeds, men would rule Middle-earth. If he fails, Middle-earth will fall into a darkness one could not fathom. It could be the beginning of the end. I urge you, King Thranduil of the Greenwood realm, to lead your people across the sea to Valinor before it is too late." He stopped reading. He couldn't nor wouldn't leave Middle-earth until he knew the fate of his son. He had tried the first time to make Lord Elrond understand this, but the Lord of Rivendell knew not of his pain. He hadn't lost his son, growing up without his father. He didn't have to deal with the guilt that pained inside him for chasing his one and only child away. Lord Elrond was blessed with 3 children and an adopted child, whereas Thranduil only had Legolas. Elrond had never lost one of his children. "Hervuin," Captain Irinian said from behind him. "My lord." Thranduil turned. "Yes, Captain?" The captain caught sight of the letter in the king's hand as he approached. "From Lord Elrond, sire?" he asked. The look Thranduil sent him spoke volumes, and Captain Irinian changed the subject. "I just came back from patrol. It is quiet." Thranduil turned back to the still trees of the forest. "Do not lax your arms, Captain Irinian. It would not remain so for too much longer," he said, glancing back down at the letter. Whether he was speaking of the Greenwood or of Middle-earth in general, he did not know. The group of riders moved through the forest. Most were eyeing the trees warily. Legolas couldn't blame the men for their caution. They did just witness the violent nature of the trees against the orcs. He rode Arod at the rear, feeling more at ease than the men and dwarf. Gimli rode with Aragon in front of him, his eyes flicker uneasily at one tree to the other. Beside Aragorn was Eomer. The Rohan man kept his face clear of emotion, but his eyes twitched as he kept a wary eye out for danger. Gandalf rode at the front next to King Theoden. Fog drifted through the trees, swirling as if in a dance. Legolas glanced up as the low sounds of lumbering trees were heard around them. His eyes narrowed as he tried to catch the words spoken from the trees, words only he, an elf, was able to hear. The trees were satisfied about something. They reached the end of the forest, and Isengard came into view. It was a gloomy sight that was broken by the sound of laughter. Curious, the company moved forward into the sunlight. Legolas' eyes slightly widened in surprise at the sight that greeted them. The Ents were walking all over the ruins of Isengard. The ground was flooded with water. Smoke was rising from the fire that once resided there. Sitting on the wall by the entrance were two small familiar figures, smoking a pipe. They were laughing, their faces lit up with glee. Legolas' mouth twitched into a smile. Merry stood up and greeted them with his arms opened wide. "Welcome, my lords, to Isengard. You young rascals! A merry chase you've led us on, and now we find you feasting and smoking," Gimli snapped. "We are sitting on the field of victory," Pippin started to say, enjoying a few well-earned comforts. "The salted pork is particularly good." There was a moment of silence before Gimli said, "Salted pork?" Legolas shook his head in amusement upon hearing Gandalf mutter, "Hobbits in an impatient tone. "Oh, look, Merry, it's that elf from the forest," Pippin shouted gleefully when he caught sight of Legolas. Legolas nodded his head in recognition. "Young Pippin and Merry, it is refreshing to see you again. Treebeard took care of your needs, I hope." Merry nodded. "He sure did, Master Legolas. We are actually under the orders from Treebeard, who's taken over management of Isengard." "Come then," Gandalf said. "Let's go greet the new management." "Come, Merry Pippin." Eomer offered to take Merry onto his horse with him, and Pippin sat in front of Gandalf. As they approached Orthanc, the tower of Isengard, Treebeard met up with them. "Young Master Gandalf, I'm glad you've come. Wood and water, stock and stone I can master, but there's a wizard to manage here, locked in his tower." Gandalf nodded his understanding before moving towards the tower. Legolas stayed back as the rest of the group followed him. He glanced up at Treebeard. "Thank you for watching the hobbits. It was my pleasure to help, young elf." A soft but clear voice interrupted their conversation. "You have fought many wars and slain many men, Theoden King, and made peace afterwards." Legolas turned his attention to the top of the tower. With his elvish eyes, he could clearly see an old man in white robes. He was holding a white staff. He had a white gray beard and long white gray hair. "So that is Saruman," Legolas stated, staring up at the figure. Treebeard nodded. Saruman continued to speak, but Legolas turned away from the conversation. "Treebeard, I wanted to ask you something." "Ask, my friend. I was wondering what you know of Mirkwood. Surely you've heard something of the trees in the forest of Mirkwood." "Mirkwood," Treebeard said slowly. "Yes, a dark place, filled with the dying and wounded trees. Fester from the black ink coming out of Mordor and Dol Guldur. Its poison is destroying life in the forest, a dangerous place." Legolas frowned. That wasn't new information, but it was still very discouraging to hear of the darkness of the place that might be his home. "What of the elves there? Know anything of them?" Treebeard paused in thought. As the Treebeard worked around his slow thinking process, Legolas turned his attention brief to the happenings by the tower. Gandalf was speaking. "More are now at risk, but you could save them, Saruman. You were deep in the enemy's council. Legolas turned his gaze up at Saruman as the other wizard began to speak. So, you have come here for information. I have some for you. The wizard reached into his robes and pulled out a smooth, dark, round object. Legolas's eyes widened. It was a glowing Palantír. Something festers in the heart of Middle-earth. Something that you have failed to see. But the Great Eye has seen it. Even now, he presses his advantage. His attack will come soon. I'm afraid I don't, Treebeard said, bringing back Legolas's attention. It has been so very long since I last heard from the trees in the greenwood. Last I heard, the elves were pushed north when the darkness overcame the forest. They live beyond the mountains of Mirkwood. They are a wary people. They once talked to the trees, but could no longer find the time with all the fight they are doing against the darkness. Why do you ask? Legolas sighed. Mirkwood may be home, he answered softly. Saying that out loud gave Legolas a happy feeling. It made him want to smile. A home. He may have a place to call home. It was something he never had for as long as he could remember. His family, his people, his home. It would be a place he could belong. Treebeard nodded. That is good. A young sapling shouldn't be so far from his family for so long. He needs roots. Legolas smiled. I thank you, Treebeard. Save your pity and your mercy. I have no use for it. Saruman suddenly sneered. Legolas looked over just in time to see Saruman shoot a fireball from his staff and fling to straight at Gandalf. The flames engulfed the other wizard and his horse, Shadowfax. Blistering heat radiate from the bright flames. Legolas gasped and stumbled instinctively away from the flames. He raised his hands up to block his eyes from the heat and light. The flames died away, and to Legolas's relief and astonishment, Gandalf stood there, unscathed and unfazed. Pippin's eyes were wide, frightened by the attack, but otherwise unharmed. Gandalf magic had protected him as well. Gandalf shook his head in disappointment and raised his hand. Your staff is broken. The staff in Saruman's hand shattered, and he glared down at Gandalf. A figure appeared behind him, and Legolas recognized him as Grima Wormtongue. Now that I think about it, young Master Elf. Legolas turned his attention back to Treebeard. I do remember hearing of something in Mirkwood many years ago. What was it? Legolas waited patiently. Get down, cur, Saruman yelled. Legolas looked over just as Saruman slapped Grima hard enough to send him to the ground and out of sight. Saruman, you were deep in the enemy's council. Tell us what you know, Gandalf demanded. You withdraw your guard, and I will tell you where your doom will be decided. Legolas saw Grima approach Saruman's back. His sharp eyes noticed the knife in the man's hands, and Legolas quickly reached for his arrows. I will not be held prisoner here, Saruman said, not realizing the danger behind him. Grima stabbed Saruman in the back. Twice, Saruman let out a gasping sounded. Legolas shot his arrow, and it hit Grima in the chest. He fell down and didn't get back up. The group of men below the tower glanced back at him, having forgotten that he was there. Legolas watched Saruman's body fall off the tower and get impaled by the spoke of a large wheel. Gandalf pushed his horse forward and shook his head. He turned to them. Send word to all our allies and to every corner of Middle-earth that still stands free. The enemy moves against us. We need to know where he will strike. They all turned back to the wheel as it turned, sliding Saruman's body under the water to his grave. Something about the prince dying, I believe, Treebeard said, watching the wheel turn. Legolas turned his attention back to him. Dying or missing, I cannot remember. Legolas smiled grimly. Thank you, my friend, he said, discarding the information about the prince. knowing it was of no importance to him. They both turned back to the scene, watching Saruman's feet disappear into the water. "The filth of Saruman is washing away," Treebeard said. "Trees will come back to live here. Young trees, wild trees." Legolas glanced around and tried to picture the desolate area filled with young and strong tress. The land needed it, and he would love to see the land filled with green once again. "Pippin!" he heard Gandalf yell. Legolas glanced back over and saw Pippin standing the knee-deep water. He was reaching down and picked something up. "Bless my bark," Treebeard said, seeing the orb in Pippin's hands. It was the Palantír Saruman was holding before he fell to his death. Peregrine took. "I'll take that, my lad," Gandalf said. "Quickly now." Legolas watched as Pippin reluctantly handed over the orb to Gandalf. The white wizard quickly covered it up in his robes, daring not to touch. "Ride with Legolas, Pippin," he said. Legolas urged his horse forward and helped Pippin get settled in front of him. "Let's return to Edoras," King Theoden said. "There is nothing else we can do here." Gandalf nodded his approval, and, with a last goodbye to Treebeard, they headed back to Edoras. Legolas sat against the wall of the Golden Halls. Night had fallen long ago, and those inside were still partying over their victory at Helm's Deep. He could hear the music and laughter from where he sat. He was facing northeast, the direction he knew Mirkwood stood. He felt a pull in that direction, but he couldn't tell if it was a good time to leave. The Battle of Helm's Deep was over, and they were celebrating the victory. Was this the end? Could he leave for Mirkwood, or was there more to come? Of course there was more to come. Saruman had told them that much. They just don't know where. His quest with Aragorn, Gimli, and Gandalf was not yet completed. When he did return to Mirkwood, would there be anyone waiting for him? Parents, grandparents, an aunt or uncle? He sighed as he realized that there might not be anyone waiting for him. He was just an elfing, and elf children was viewed as precious and treasured gifts. The price of immortality was the lack of children. Something terrible must have happened for him to end up alone in the wilderness. "You weren't inside," a voice interrupted his solemn thought. Legolas remained silent as Aragorn sat down next to him. They sat in comfortable silence, each in their own thoughts. "There were 8 of us," Aragorn suddenly said quietly. Legolas glanced over at him. "Pardon?" "We set off from Rivendell with a single purpose: protect the Ringbearer and make sure he gets to Mordor alive." "Ringbearer?" He wanted to ask, but Aragorn kept talking. "We lost Gandalf in the mines of Moria. We lost another, Boromir's son of Denethor II, the steward of Gondor, on our way down the Anduin. During that time, 2 of our hobbits, the Ringbearer and his friend, went their own way to Mordor, and Merry and Pippin were captured by Uruk-hai. Gimli and I decided to save Merry and Pippin instead, following the Ringbearer." "The Ringbearer?" Legolas finally asked, even though he had a feeling he knew what ring the Ringbearer held. Aragorn nodded and pulled out his pipe. Legolas waited patiently as Aragorn lit it. The one ring, Sauron's ring. Legolas closed his eyes and sighed. "So it has been found," he stated. Rumor had circulated of its discovery, but Legolas hadn't known any more about it than that. Aragorn nodded, and the Ringbearer was sent to destroy it in the fires of Mount Doom. It didn't escape Legolas's notice that Aragorn withheld the name of the Ringbearer from him, but he was hardly surprised. He was surprised that Aragorn was telling him anything about their original quest. "Why tell me this?" he asked. "I believe you have proven yourself trustworthy," and Gandalf agreed. "You have been traveling with us and continue to travel with us since. It was time for you to know why." Legolas nodded his gratitude. "Thank you, my friend." He glanced away and stared in the direction of Mirkwood again. "What weighs heavily on your mind, Legolas?" Aragorn asked softly. Legolas glanced sideways at him, debating if he should confide in the man. "You grew up in Rivendell?" Aragorn nodded. "Then you know the value of an elfing." Aragorn nodded again. Legolas paused to gather his thoughts. "Why do you believe I was left alone?" he asked. Aragorn stared at him. The realization in his eyes told Legolas that he finally understood where he was going with this. Just because you found yourself alone doesn't mean there isn't anyone waiting for your return, Legolas. Legolas shook his head, having a hard time believing him. "I must have been with my parents, traveling between elven kingdoms when something happened. They must have died, and I lived. It makes sense. Don't assume anything, my friend. Maybe you were told to run for safety and gotten lost. Your parents may have survived and tried to find you. Or maybe your parents weren't even with you. The point is, Legolas, you don't know. Don't assume. When we are done here, I'll travel with you to Mirkwood. We'll find out what really happened, together." Legolas stared at him and discovered Aragorn's sincerity. He nodded. "Thank you, friend." Aragorn returned the smile. Legolas suddenly tilted his head to the side, and his ears perked at a noise. "What do you hear?" Aragorn asked. Legolas glanced back at him and smiled. "I hear men going to bed, sounding very drunk, and a dwarf asking, very loudly, for more ale." Aragorn chuckled. "Yes, I suppose I should go help the very drunk dwarf get to his bed before he keeps everyone up all night." He stood. He glanced down at Legolas. "Are you coming inside?" he asked. Legolas shook his head. "I am content right here for the moment." Aragorn nodded without question and headed inside, once again leaving Legolas in his thoughts. Legolas stayed there for the rest of the night, not moving. Those of Rohan who stumbled home very late would have sworn Legolas was a statue. It unnerved them. Legolas knew none of the talk, nor would he care. He sat as the hours went by. It was nearing dawn when he finally moved. Something stirred within him. He sensed an evil veil. He stood and faced Mordor. His eyes narrowed as his senses grew disturbed. A darkness seemed to cover the stars. A movement. The movement was quick, restless in his mind's eye. There was such anger in the heart of the movement. He heard footsteps behind him, but didn't need to look to know it was Aragorn. "Did you stay out here all night, Legolas?" the man asked as he stood beside him. Legolas ignored his question. The stars are veiled. Something stirs in the east. A sleepless malice. The eye of the enemy is moving. Moving to where? Aragorn asked quietly. Legolas shook his head as he tried to sense the answer to the question. He is. He paused, struggling to pinpoint where the eye was going. His eyes widened, and he turned to face Aragorn. He is here. Just then, they heard a scream coming from inside. That was one of the hobbits, Legolas said as the two of them rushed into the Golden Hall. Aragorn was in front, but Legolas was close behind. Somebody help him! That was Merry, Aragorn noted. They quickly came upon the door and rushed inside. Pippin was holding on the Palantír, writhing in pain on the ground, screaming as the orb glowed. Merry was kneeling by him, but was afraid to touch him. His eyes were wide with his panic as he stared at his thrashing cousin. Aragorn didn't waste a second as he knelt next to him and took the orb. He began yelling in pain, and Legolas rushed forward. Aragorn! He took the man's shoulders to steady him, and Aragorn threw the Palantír away from him. The man leaned his weight against Legolas's legs and breathed heavily in exhaustion. Pippin, Merry yelled, rushing as his shaking and frightened cousin. Gandalf quickly threw a cloth over the orb, having woken up by the screaming, and turned to Pippin. "Fool of a took," he scowled. While Gandalf was tending to Pippin, Legolas turned his attention to a shaky Aragorn. "Are you all right?" he asked. Aragorn sat up and nodded. "Yes, I will be. Thank you." Legolas helped him stand up before they turned their attention to Gandalf, who was asking Pippin questions. "What did you see?" he asked urgently, his hands on Pippin's face to keep the hobbit focused on him. "A tree," the hobbit said shakily. There was a white tree in a courtyard of stone. It was dead. The city was burning. Legolas heard Aragorn's sharp intake. "Minas Tirith?" Gandalf asked. "Is that what you saw?" "I saw." Pippin began crying. "I saw him. I could hear his voice in my head. What did you tell him? Speak." "He asked me my name. I didn't answer." Pippin, he kept his frightened eyes on Gandalf. "He hurt me." "What did you tell him about Frodo and the ring?" Gandalf asked. Aragorn may not have told him the name of the ring-bearer, but it didn't take a lot of thought to figure out who Frodo was. Pippin shook his head. Nothing, he whispered. I told him nothing. Chapter 8. The meeting with the king went well for the most part. It was decided that Gandalf would ride out to Gondor with Pippin to warn them. If the beacon was lit, Rohan would answer. At least, Legolas hoped they would answer. King Theoden didn't seem too willing to aid Gondor. Legolas stood with Aragorn as they watched Gandalf lead Merry and Pippin to the stables. "This would be hard on the hobbits," Legolas said as he watched the two hobbits walk side by side. "They seem very close." They disappeared into the stables. Aragorn nodded. "They will see each other again. I know it. It isn't the end." They silently watched as Shadowfax galloped out of the stables with Gandalf and Pippin on top. Merry came running out of the stables. "Merry!" Aragorn yelled. He ran down the steps to follow. Legolas took a step forward, only to pause. It was best if Aragorn comfort the hobbit. They knew each other better. Half an hour later, Legolas spied Aragorn escorting Merry back to the Golden Hall. The days dragged on after Gandalf left. Legolas found himself getting restless within the walled town of Edoras. Never had he spent so long a time in a walled area, not even in Helm's Deep. He paced from one end to the other, staying outside the walls of the Golden Halls for days at a time, sleeping on the roof, closest to the stars. He didn't think anyone noticed his attitude. A week after Gandalf and Pippin left, Aragorn approached him while he was sitting just outside the Golden Halls. "You have been restless, my friend." He sat down next to him. "Why don't you take Arod out for a ride around Edoras? It will help you feel less trapped." It was almost unnerving how well Aragorn seemed to know him, only to remember he grew up around elves. "I don't want to be out when the beacons are finally lit," Legolas answered. "I'm afraid I will enjoy myself far too much, and time will pass me by. We'll have little time to make our way to Gondor, and I don't want anyone to spend precious time looking for me or waiting for my return. I do not believe you could keep us from leaving in a timely manner, Legolas. I do not wish for you to." He stopped as he stared at something in the distance. His eyes widened, and he quickly stood up. "The beacon," he whispered before running into the hall. Legolas turned and saw the distant flickering of the fire on top of the mountain. He stood up and quickly followed Aragorn. He arrived just in time to hear King Theoden's answer. "Then Rohan will answer. Muster the Rohirrim." That next hour was full of movement as soldiers began to armor themselves and gather their horses. They were planning on assembling at Dunharrow. Gamling was dispatched. to find every able-bodied man across the Rittermark. They would ride to war in 3 days. Now is the hour, riders of Rohan. Oaths you have taken. Now fulfill them all, to lord and land. Eomer cried out to them before leading the men out of Edoras. Legolas rode next to Merry and his pony and glanced down at him. I've known you for only a short time, my little friend. Merry glanced up and gave him his attention, which is why I express my concern. He nodded towards the hilt of Merry's sword. Are you prepared to use it? Merry's face tightened with determination. I am, Master Elf. I need to, for Frodo, Sam, Pippin, and the Shire. Legolas studied the hobbit before nodding. I see you have changed much in a short time. You've become a stronger hobbit, a brave one. Merry's face lit up with pride. Aye, he said, a brave hobbit. They shared grins before urging their 4-legged animals forward to follow the crowd. Thranduil was once again in his office, going through the reports of the latest spider sightings. They were pretty much the same as yesterday and the day before that. It was almost discouraging how silent it all has been. There was a knock at his door. Enter, he called out. His top advisor, Lolandir, entered. He bowed. Hirvoin, my lord. Yes, Lolandir. There is an elf from Lothlorien with an urgent message from the Marchwarden, Haldir. He said he was ordered to hand-deliver it to you personally. Bring him in, Thranduil ordered, without showing his surprise. The message must be of great importance to have such strict orders. The elf that came in looked weary and battle-worn. He was a few shades paler than normal and dirty. Dry mud coated the bottom of his legs, from the knees down. His trousers had several holes, and his tunic was torn at the shoulder. Thranduil could see a large wound where the tear was, and felt a flicker of concern. It was bleeding. The elf seemed to sway on his feet with exhaustion. Thranduil eyed Lolandir in question, wondering why the elf hadn't been taken straight to the healers upon his arrival. But he was unable to get a response before the Lorien elf spoke. Thranduil, king of Mirkwood, the tired elf said with a bow. I am Captain Carnazir, a warrior under the leadership of the late Marchwarden, Haldir. Thranduil perked up at the word late. I am sorry to hear that, Captain. Your Marchwarden was a good elf and a fierce warrior. Carnazir nodded, his eyes drifting down for a moment in grief. But he pulled himself together quickly, reaching into his tunic. I have been asked to deliver this to you most urgently, he said, pulling out a wrinkled, sealed letter. I am to see to it that you receive and read it, sire. He headed the letter over to him. Curiously, Thranduil carefully undid the seal and opened the letter. There was silence in the room as his eyes flickered from one line to another, with hungry eyes. He sat up in his seat, his face froze in disbelief. With a zeal thought long lost, he snapped his eyes up to Lolandir. Take Captain Carnazir to the healers. Make sure he gets whatever he needs and wants. He turns to Carnazir. Captain, you are free to rest here for as long as you desire. Relief flooded into the captain's eyes. Thank you, liege. Thranduil turned back to Lolandir and ordered, and send for Captain Irinian immediately. The door closed behind the two elves, and Thranduil glanced back down at the letter, before his gaze shifted to another letter that sat innocently beside the pile of reports. The letter sent by Lord Elrond. His gaze went back to the letter in his hand from Haldir. His heart pounded in his chest with mixed emotions, knowing what it meant. A few minutes later, there was a knock on his door. Enter, he called out urgently. Captain Irinian entered. You wish to speak to me, Hirvoin? Thranduil nodded. How many elves can we spare? He asked. Captain Irinion blinked, showing his surprise. Pardon, Hirvoin? Thranduil glanced at him. his gaze intense. "How many elves can we spare from Mirkwood?" he asked again. Confused, Captain Aranian shook his head. "Not many. I am not confident in this moment of inactivity from Dol Guldur." Thranduil nodded. "I'll take as much as Mirkwood can spare." "My king, just where are we taking them? If you do not mind me asking." Thranduil glanced at the letter from Elrond. "Not we, Captain. Just me. You are needed here, in case of an attack. I'll be leading what elves I can take with me to the Black Gate." Captain Aranian stepped forward in alarm. "My king, I cannot." "I've decided, Captain," Thranduil snapped. "Prepare what elves you can give me. We leave for the Black Gate in 3 days at dawn. I cannot spare you any more time than that." Captain Aranian didn't give up trying. Persuade his king not to go. "My liege, it is suicide. What do you wish to accomplish? Our army would never be able to." Thranduil suddenly stood up, his chair falling over and clashing to the ground with a sound bang. "I've decided," he repeated harshly. He leaned over his desk and gave his captain a stern, unfailing look. Captain Aranian stepped back in surprise. He sighed to calm his worried heart. "At least allow someone else to go, King Thranduil. Allow me to go in your stead." Thranduil threw the letter on his desk with such force that it made a snap sound. The sound made Captain Aranian flinch. "No, Captain," he retorted, stressing the title as a reminder of who outranked who. Captain Aranian closed his mouth to stop the protest. "Forgive me," he said with his head bowed. "At least allow me the privilege of understanding why, Hervwin." Thranduil glanced down at the letter. He sighed in defeat. Captain Aranian was lucky that Thranduil needed him and liked him. He was one of the only ones that dared to argue with the King of Mirkwood. It didn't help that his son used to have a great fondness for the elf as well. "I need to be the one to retrieve my son. No other could go in my place. Not this time." Captain Aranian's eyes widened. "Prince Legolas?" Thranduil nodded. "I got word from the late Marchwarden of Lothlorien," he said, lifting the letter to show his captain. "Legolas was sighted traveling with Lord Aragorn. If he travels with him still, the only place I know Legolas would show up is at the Black Gate. Lord Elrond foreseen a battle taking place there with Lord Aragorn leading the attack." He glanced at the captain. "Ready what elves I am to bring with me, Captain," he ordered, "and send Lolindir back in. He will be leading Mirkwood in my stead. Let's just hope I make it in time." Legolas sighted Aragorn standing by the edge of the cliff, staring down at the burning fires of the soldiers below. It was the first night after arriving at the encampment at Dunharrow, and this was the first time he saw Aragorn today. The man had been speaking King Theoden almost all day about their plans. Aragorn looked tense. His body was stiff, despite the hour. Knowing the body of men, Legolas knew Aragorn had to be weary. Legolas approached him and glanced down at the valley below. "You are restless, Aragorn. You need rest. There is not enough men to break through the lines of Mordor," Aragorn said, ignoring Legolas's concern. "But we cannot wait. We ride at dawn, but I fear they would ride to their deaths." Legolas snapped his eyes to the man beside him. "Don't, Aragorn. Don't despair. Remember what you told me at Helm's Deep, when our chances of winning were slim and I had despaired." Aragorn turned to him and Legolas continued. "You indicated that you will die fighting if that is what it took. You would die fighting for what is right, despite the likelihood of death. Are you still willing to do that?" Aragorn nodded with a determined gaze. "More than ever, Legolas. Then go get some sleep and rest. We will need you in full strength tomorrow, my friend." Aragorn gave him a half-amused smile. "I am not the only one that should rest. You need it as well. Not as much as you. As an elf, I can last a while without sleep. Yes. Elves and their resilience. How I envy you, Aragorn said as he started to head back to his tent. Legolas chuckled and shook his head. Good night, Aragorn, he called to the retreating figure. Good night, Aragorn called back. Legolas headed back to his tent, but did not enter. He was enjoying the fresh air too much. Instead, he sat on a log by the entrance and worked on his arrows, carving new ones, sharpening old ones. He tested the string on his bow. He must have been working on that for at least an hour before he felt intense eyes upon him. He glanced up curiously and eyed his surroundings. As the hour was late, most were in their tents, but there were a few soldiers minding their own business by a fire, and a soldier or two trying to calm the horses. There was a murmur of voices in the air from the Rohan men, but none were looking his way. His gaze fell on a strange figure standing some paces away from him. The figure was wearing a dark cloak, with the hood hiding the facial features. The figure was facing him, and Legolas knew the figure was staring at him. Legolas stared back, feeling uneasy and tense. He didn't like not knowing who the mysterious figure was, not when they seemed to show such interest in him. A Rohan guard approached the man and spoke briefly with him. The figure turned his gaze away from Legolas, much to his relief, and followed the guard to King Theoden's tent. The figure disappeared inside. Unnerved, Legolas set his arrows aside and took a deep breath to calm himself. He glanced back up when his sharp ears caught the sound of the door flap of the king's tent move. The guard had exited and was heading towards Aragorn's tent. Legolas watched, curiously, as the man poked his head into the tent. A few seconds later, the man left, but didn't return to the king's tent. A moment later, Aragorn left his tent, and Legolas watched as he walked to King Theoden's tent and entered. Just seconds after, King Theoden left the tent. Legolas was beyond curious. Obviously, the figure came to speak to Aragorn alone. Legolas sighed and pushed his curiosity down. It would do him no good, and Aragorn would tell him, if he so desired to. Legolas reached down and picked up his arrows again. As he worked on sharpening the arrowhead, his eyes would flicker over to King Theoden's tent. Aragorn was in there for a while before he came out, a new sword strapped to his side, and his eyes looking more drawn with worry and determination. The future King of Men paused just outside the tent's entrance and glanced around until his eyes met Legolas. Legolas set his arrow's aid once again when he saw Aragorn making his way to him. He stood up once the man reached him. "Is everything well, Aragorn?" he asked. Aragorn hesitated and nodded. "It will be, Legolas." He glanced back at the king's tent before turning back to him. "He wants to see you," he said, before walking back to his own tent. Legolas blinked in surprise as his gaze landed on the king's tent. He picked up his bow and quiver of arrows, not ready to meet an unknown without weapons. He cautiously approached the king's tent. He paused just before the door flap, but his curiosity pushed him to enter the threshold. The first thing he noticed about the man on the other side was the fact that it wasn't a man, but an elf. The elf stance commanded respect and showed his authority. He was obviously some elf of power and wisdom, an older elf. He was tall, with dark hair. His eyes showed his wisdom and age. "Do you know who I am, Legolas?" the elf asked. Legolas didn't blink when the elf said his name, believing Aragorn had told him. He shook his head, his eyes firmly on the unknown stranger. "Should I?" he asked, his body tensed. "I am Lord Elrond of Rivendell." Legolas' eyes widened. He tilted his head down slightly in respect, knowing it was his duty as an elf to show respect to the Lord of Rivendell. "Lord Elrond." "Yes, Legolas," Lord Elrond walked towards him, eyeing him up and down. I had not foreseen your presence. I wonder how different the visions of the future will be, now that I know of your presence. Legolas couldn't help himself from asking, "Do you know who I am, my lord?" he asked. "Where I come from? My parents?" Lord Elrond raised an eyebrow at him. "No memory of who you are?" Legolas shook his head. There was a pause before he spoke again. "I am afraid it is not my place to say, young Legolas. No, not my place at all. I have a task for you," he said, quickly jumping to a different topic. "A task?" Legolas questioned. "Pardon me, Lord Elrond, but I am not your subject. I am not an elf of Rivendell for you to order around." Lord Elrond raised a hand, and his eyes narrowed. "Calm yourself, Legolas," he ordered firmly. "You are correct. You're not a Lindon elf, but part Sindarin and part Sylvan. Think of it as a favor or a request, if it pleases you. At this moment, Aragorn is packing up to take the Dimhold Road." Legolas' eyes widened in surprise. "I would feel more comfortable if my son had someone with him during this journey. You wish me to go with Aragorn into the mountain," Legolas stated. "What makes you think they would answer to Aragorn? As the king of Gondor, they will answer. But I fear for him still. He is, after all, still immortal." Lord Elrond stood there, waiting for his answer. Legolas didn't hesitate. He nodded. "I shall go with him." "Thank you, Legolas. You need to get ready before Aragorn leaves without you." Legolas nodded, but hesitated. He wanted to know more about himself. The Lord of Rivendell let slip that he was part Sindarin and part Sylvan elf. And, with that little information, Legolas craved more. But he knew there are things more important, so without further question, he backed out of the tent. He sighed in frustration as he headed towards his tent. Why wouldn't anyone tell him who he was? How difficult would it be just to admit it? First Gandalf, and now Lord Elrond refused to tell him. As he was walking to his tent, he saw Gimli sharpening his axe by one of the pit fires. An idea came to him. "Gimli!" he called out. The dwarf turned and eyed him. "Aye? Aragorn is going to take the Dimhold Road." Gimli's eyes widened. "I need to pack up our stuff, but you need to make sure he doesn't leave without us." Gimli nodded. "What the devil made him decided to go there?" he asked. "The need for more allies. An army," Legolas answered. "I'll pack your stuff as well. Keep watch for him." He turned and headed the rest of the way to his tent to pack up. It took several minutes to pack up everything. Legolas placed everything on Arad and set out towards the Dimhold Road. He picked up speed when he saw Aragorn ahead of him, stopped by a hard-headed dwarf. Aragorn was shaking his head at Gimli. "Not this time. This time you must stay, Gimli." Legolas approached his side. "Have you learned nothing of the stubbornness of dwarves?" he asked with a faint grin. Aragorn gave him a weary look. "Might as well accept it. We're going with you, laddie," Gimli said, leaning on his axe. "You will be grateful to have your friends on your side," Legolas pointed out. Aragorn sighed in defeat and nodded. "All right, get on the horse, Gimli." Once they were all on the horses, they started off onto the Dimhold Road. Soldiers were watching them go, confused and worried. "Lord Aragorn!" a soldier cried out, but the riders didn't pause or look back. As they were engulfed by the shadows of the mountain, they rode quietly for several hours. The sun had risen, but it didn't do much in lighting their path. If anything, the rise of the sun enhanced the dark shadows of the mountain. Legolas couldn't relax. He felt eyes on him, everywhere. His own keen eyes couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. Arad felt tense underneath him. He reached over and patted his neck to comfort him. He raised his eyes above to the large cliffs around them. They felt menacing. Aragorn and his 2 companies were not welcomed here. What kind of army would linger in such a place? Gimli suddenly asked from his spot behind Aragorn. One that is cursed. Legolas answered quietly, his eyes not leaving the passing cliffs. Long ago, the men of the mountain swore an oath to the last king of Gondor to come to his aid, to fight. But when the time came, when Gondor's need was dire, they fled, vanishing into the darkness of the mountain. And so Isildur cursed them, never to rest, until they had fulfilled their pledge. He explained, "Who shall call them from the grey twilight? The forgotten people, the heir of him to whom the oath they swore. From the north shall he come. Need shall drive him. He shall pass the door to the paths of the dead." He recited the old prophecy he heard from the rangers of the north many years ago. For an elf who didn't grow up around other elves, you sure know a lot, Gimli noted dryly. Legolas glanced at him. "I am over 2,000 years old and was a very curious elfing." He mentally shook his head at the wonder of being an elfing. It seemed like it was such a long time ago. At that time, he didn't wish or cared to find his family. He enjoyed being alone, wandering place to place. It was fun and adventurous. He didn't think much of his origin, and he lived each day like it would have been his last. He read everything he could get his hands on and enjoyed listening into others' conversations. It wasn't until recently that the thoughts of his unknown home plagued him. "We are nearly there," Aragorn muttered as he slid off his horse. Legolas and Gimli quickly followed his lead. "You sure this is a great idea?" Gimli whispered as he walked alongside Legolas. "We have no other choice," Aragorn answered before pressing forward. They came to an opening in the cliff at the end of the path. It was adorned with skulls. Hieroglyphs were etched into the top of the doorway. Legolas shivered at the feeling of cold death. He could feel the eyes of the dead on them, watching, waiting. He shook it off as he patted Arod's neck to calm him. Aragorn was already walking towards the opening, and Gimli was tightening his hands around his axe. "The very warmth of my blood seems stolen away," Gimli muttered. Legolas stepped forward to read the hieroglyphs. "The way is shut. It was made by those who were dead, and the dead keep it. The way is shut." A whistling wind came from the tunnel, as if a being was inhaling and exhaling. The air from the tunnel passed them, and the horses reared up, neighing in fear. They tried to keep their hold on them, but the horses broke free and dashed back down the path. "Brago!" Aragorn yelled to his horse, but the horses were long gone. Legolas felt a brief moment of worry, but knew Arod was an intelligent and loyal horse. He would return when Legolas needed him. Aragorn sighed and turned back to the entrance. "I do not fear death," he said confidently before entering the mountain. The very reason why Lord Elrond sent Legolas with him. Legolas tightened his jaw in determination. He was not looking forward to entering a place surrounded by stone again, but he must follow Aragorn. He walked forward and entered the darkness of the tunnel. Chapter 9. Skulls of the dead littered the walls of the cave. Legolas's sight caught the lasting moments of their deaths. He leaned forward, his eyes catching the shapes in the shadows. He could see the shapes of men floating around and horses in the distance. He could feel their fear and anger. It seeped into his skin like the black poison of an orc arrow. Legolas inhaled to try and separate the dead's feelings and his own. "What is it?" Gimli asked him. "What do you see?" "I see shapes of men and of horses," he answered tightly. "Where?" Gimli asked behind him. Legolas ignored his question and continued. "Pale banners like shreds of cloud. Spears rise like winter thickets through a shroud of mist." He paused as his ears picked up the settle wind moving around them. "The dead are following. They have been summoned. He quickly followed Aragorn further into the mountain, where mist rose up and quickly surrounded them. "Legolas!" he heard Gimli yell from behind. Legolas glanced back in time to see Gimli rush up to them, but paused as the smoke rose around him. Legolas glanced down as he felt the cool sensation of the mist rising up. It took the shape of arms. They reached for him, as if to pull him down. He waved his hands around to brush them aside. He could feel the pain of the dead keenly, and he found it difficult to focus. It wasn't the only thing taking his focus. The dark, cold, and lifeless rock around him felt draining. "Do not look down," he heard Aragorn said from somewhere ahead of him. Legolas was able to shake the pain away and focused on his voice. The darkness and coldness of the place was hard for the elf in him, but his determination was equally as strong. He walked forward, following the man in front of him. The crackling of the skulls beneath them echoed loudly in the cavern from Gimli's loud and heavy steps. Legolas sighed in relief as soon as they reached solid ground. Aragorn and Legolas paused to wait for Gimli to catch up. As soon as he did, Aragorn didn't waste another moment before moving on. "Come, we must not linger. We are running out of time," he said, picking up the pace. They ran down a narrowed pathway and entered a great underground hall with a large doorway. Legolas stared at the large cavern, sensing the thousands of dead soldiers. He opened his mouth to warn Aragorn, but was interrupted. "Who enters my domain?" a voice called out. Legolas turned to face the large stone staircase as a glowing green figure appeared. The skeletal figure wore a large crown on his head, showing his status as the king to the army, the king of the dead. The king was missing his nose. His eyes were like white pits of hatred and weariness. He had no lips, so his teeth were bared. Thin, wiry hair was seen coming out of his crowned helmet. He had a loose red cloak on, but it was translucent, just like the rest of him, and thick armor. "One who will have your allegiance," Aragorn responded, seemingly unfazed at the sudden appearance of the ghost. The king of the dead seemed to sneer at him. The dead do not suffer the living to pass. Aragorn took a stubborn step forward and said firmly, putting as much authority into his words as he could, "You will suffer me." The king let out a deep laugh that echoed around the cavern. It sent a feeling of unease down Legolas's spine. There was a suddenly feeling of a presence behind him, and he turned. Aragorn must have felt the same thing because he turned as well, just in time to see a translucent city appear, a city that was built by the dead. It was large and green. Dead soldiers walked in formation from the city and encircled them. Legolas eyed the green ghosts of the dead with tense uneasiness. He tightened his grip on his bow with anticipation. "The way is shut," the king of the dead started to say. Legolas turned his attention back to him with his jaw tight. "It was made by those who are dead, and the dead keep it." He paused before repeating, "The way is shut." He began to approach Aragorn with determination. "Now you must die." Legolas quickly grabbed an arrow and shot at the king, but the arrow passed right through his head. He inwardly growled with frustration and disappointment as he took an uneasy step towards Aragorn, ready to do anything, even if that included stepping between the blade and Aragorn if it came to it. "I summon you to fulfill your oath," Aragorn said. The king, still approaching, said, "None but the king of Gondor may command me." He lifted up his sword to strike at Aragorn. The man drew his sword quickly, just as the ghost took a swing at him. Aragorn parried the blow with the sword of Elendil. The king gasped. "That bind was broken," he said in surprise. Aragorn reached up and grabbed a tight hold on the king's neck, drawing his sword there as well. "It has been remade," he said before shoving the ghost back. Aragorn glanced around, talking to all of the army, and not just the king. Fight for us, and regain your honor. What say you? He surveyed the silent soldiers around them. What say you? He questioned louder as he walked amongst them. You waste your time, Aragorn, Gimli interrupted as he held up his axe. They had no honor in life. They have none now in death. Legolas glanced briefly down at the shorter figure, but he was otherwise ignored. I am Isildur's heir, Aragorn continued to say. Fight for me, and I will hold your oaths fulfilled. He faced the king again. What say you? The king of the dead smirked before he began laughing as his army began to fade away. The king was the last to fade. You have my word, Aragorn yelled out desperately. Fight, and I will release you from this living death. What say you? But the army had completely faded away. Even the fog beneath their feet drifted away. Stand, you traitors, Gimli yelled. Legolas' eyes widened as he sensed a doom heading their way. The way the wind blew, the sudden shake of the ground, the sound of rocks rolling. Legolas glanced down as something rolled into his feet. His eyes widened as his gaze fell on the white skull. More and more skulls started to roll from the staircase. With an uneasy feeling in his heart, Legolas turned to face the structure just as it started to fall to pieces. The three of them started to slowly back away as the whole structure fell and thousands of skulls trembled out. Run! Aragorn yelled before they all turned to rush towards the exit. Legolas managed to avoid stepping on the rolling skulls as he pushed his way towards the exit. The force of the skulls, though, were almost enough to knock him down. Legolas! He heard Aragorn yell over the noise of the skulls. Run! They fought their way through the sea of skulls and escaped down the narrow passageway to the outside. They burst their way out of the cliff and into the sunshine. Legolas took a deep breath, enjoying the fresh air and sunshine. His soul felt lightened instantly. Below them was a river with several black ships. On the riverbank, cities were on fire. Black smoke rose into the air. Death was in the air, a fresh death, not like that of inside the mountain. Aragorn sank to his knees, and Legolas walked over, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. Aragorn leaned sideways against Legolas's legs in defeat. Gimli stood on the man's other side, leaning forward against his axe. They just stood there, watching the ship slowly sail. Legolas tensed when he heard a sound behind them. It sounded like the coming of heavy wind. All three of them turned to the mountain just as the king of the dead appeared. The king stood before Aragorn and said, "We fight." Legolas saw Aragorn's shoulders slump slightly in relief. "Thank you," he said. "I give my word to release you for your service." The king of the dead gave him a nod. "What is your first orders?" Aragorn turned from him and nodded to the ships. "We have to stop those ships," the king chuckled with glee. "That will not be a problem. Just wait for my word." Aragorn turned to Legolas and Gimli. "Come," he said as he made his way to the shoreline. "We can intercept them there." He pointed to a rocky spot some ways down the river. "But we must hurry." The sun was just peeking behind the trees. The sky was filled with colors, pink, purple, and shades of blue, ranging from dark to light. Birds sang their morning songs. There was a warm breeze that whistled through the trees. It would have been quite the beautiful and peaceful morning if elves weren't climbing on their horses in battle wear. Thranduil stared at the small army of 500 that would accompany him to the Black Gate. There weren't many, but it would have to be enough. The elves were quiet, waiting for their orders. Thranduil was in full armor for the first time since the Battle of the Five Armies. He held his bow in one hand, and his other hand was touching the hilt of his sword by his side. Captain Erinion stood next to him. "I'm sorry, sire, but this is all Mirkwood could spare," he said as he gazed at the 500 elves. Thranduil nodded. "This is enough, Captain," he said, eyeing the small courtyard that was full of the elves waiting to leave. "It has to be." He placed his bow on his back and walked over to his white horse that stood mightily in front of the army. The good captain followed him, keeping one step behind him, as was respectful. Captain Erinion sighed as his king gracefully got onto his horse. "Are you sure you wish to go through the Brown Lands, Hervuin? If you run out of food, there will be nothing. The army would arrive at the gate, tired and hungry. That is no condition to fight." Thranduil stared forward, looking beyond the gates and into the dark woods. "It's the quickest route, Captain. We have enough supplies to see it through. It shall only take 2 weeks to arrive. We'll be fine." Captain Erinion kept his face passive, but inwardly he was shaking his head. If King Thranduil was hoping to get there in 2 weeks' time, then he would be pushing the horses hard and fast. He didn't think the king would make it in time. However, he understood the king's anxiousness. This was the closest they ever gotten to finding the prince. Any father would be doing his best to rush to his child's side. He glanced back at the king. "I am still willing to go with you, Hervuin. It would not take me long to ready myself." Thranduil nodded, his face softening just a little as he glanced down at his loyal captain. "I know, Captain Erinion, but I want you here. You will need to defend the kingdom in my absence. I would trust no one else." Captain Erinion reluctantly nodded. "Yes, Hervuin. Thank you for your confidence. I shall not fail you again." Thranduil gave him a mystified look. But before any more exchange of words could be spoken between them, Lolindir came up from behind Captain Erinion. "Farewell, my king. I shall faithfully watch over Mirkwood until your return," he promised. Thranduil nodded. "I know, Lolindir. I shall not be gone too long, and when I return, it shall be with my son." His son, Legolas. He was so close to holding his son in his arms once again, so close to bringing his son home. The last time he had felt so energized Legolas was being born. He stared at the path leading into the forest. Hopefully, it's the path that would take him to his son. He glanced back at the army, patiently waiting with his face expressionless. "Move out!" he yelled before urging his horse forward. Captain Erinion and Lolindir stepped back to watch the small army disappear into the forest. Captain Erinion shook his head. "I don't feel right letting him go without me." "I wouldn't feel right if both of you left," Lolindir said. "I have the same uneasy feeling concerning the lack of attacks from the orcs lately. I'm glad to have a military leader watching for the kingdom, and I know King Thranduil feels the same way, which is why he wouldn't let you go with him." Captain Erinion didn't respond. "You think Prince Legolas would be there?" Lolindir kept his eye on the retreating army as he answered. "He has to be." He turned to Captain Erinion. "King Thranduil has very high hopes of finally being reunited with his son. I don't think he can go through such a disappointment if his son isn't there." He turned back to army, watching as the last of them left the kingdom's gate. He would lose hope of ever returning his son to his side. He would fade. If he fades, Mirkwood is over, Captain Erinion predicted. There will be no heir to take his place. Lolindir nodded. "If he fades, I shall lead the people to the shore. The age of the elves are ending anyhow." Captain Erinion shook his head. "Let's not speak of such things. The king will be fine. He will return with Prince Legolas. Let's not loosen our grip on hope. If only he was able to go with them." He still felt it as his responsibility to make sure Legolas returned home. Lolindir nodded in agreement before turning and entering the palace. Night was falling, and there was a breeze in the air. The rocking of the ship had a calming effect to the elf on board. He didn't much care for going through the mountain and, at the moment, was enjoying the outside air instead of going below deck. He leaned against the railing and watched the waves. The wind blew across his face like a lover's caress. He closed his eyes to enjoy the feel of the wind and the smell of the earth. Legolas opened his eyes when he heard the quiet footsteps of Aragorn coming from behind him. He glanced over when the man came up next to him, leaning against the railing as well. "We'll get there late tomorrow," Aragorn said. Legolas nodded, and they relapsed into companionable silence. He stood next to Aragorn and just watched the sun sink lower in the sky, watching the yellow, red, blue, and pink slowly turn into a darker blue. He turned to Aragorn. "You told me you were raised in Rivendell, but you failed to mention Lord Elrond was the one who raised you. It makes sense, however, that Lord Elrond raised you with your heritage." Aragorn turned his body to face Legolas, using his elbow to rest against the railing. "How did you acquire such knowledge?" Neither confirming nor denying Legolas's statement. "Lord Elrond called you his son when I was speaking to him." Aragorn nodded, finally confirming. "He raised me from the time I was a young boy of 3. My father died, and my mother went to Lord Elrond to protect me. She died on the way." "Orcs." Legolas bowed in head in respect. "I'm sorry for your loss." "As am I for yours," Aragorn returned. Legolas turned back to the river. "There might not be anyone waiting for me in Mirkwood," Aragorn sighed. "We talked about this, Legolas. Don't assume the worst." Legolas shook his head. "I'm not, but even you can't deny the high possibility that anyone in my family is still there, waiting for me. They've either faded or crossed the sea. I was a young elfing. I've been lost for 2,000 years. I knew nothing of the outside world. I don't believe they would think I still live. To them, I would be dead. Losing an elfing that young would cause anyone a large amount of grief. To find peace, they would have crossed the sea or faded away from the grief. It is also Mirkwood we are speaking about. Its forest is littered with foul, ghastly creatures. Death, I imagine, is not that uncommon there. This was the first time he had entertained this idea of his family, thinking he was dead and not the other way around. I still wonder how such a young elfing could live to adulthood outside of his home. I knew nothing of this land, not when I was that young. Aragorn placed a hand on his shoulder and gave a comforting squeeze. "We will discover the truth together, Legolas. Just be patient." Legolas smirked in amusement. A man telling an elf to be patient? Aragorn took his head off his shoulder and chuckled. "Haven't you noticed how contradictory we are? I wish not to be who I am. You want to find who you are. I, a man, raised by elves, and you, an elf, raised by man." Legolas laughed. "I had not realized that before. That is quite..." He paused to think of a word to use. "Humorous." "Still chuckling," Aragorn said. "We should get some rest." He turned and headed back down deck to sleep. Legolas nodded in argument, but he didn't follow Aragorn below deck. He had set up a sleeping area by the Helms, wishing to sleep in the open air, but thoughts of his unknown family were never far from his mind. The next day found Legolas sitting on a barrel, working on sharpening the tips of his arrows and counting them. He hoped he would have enough for the battle ahead. Gimli was working on sharpening his axe right beside him, talking about his father. Legolas was only half listening, said it was the grandest adventure he has ever had, not because it was difficult and challenging, but because it was to reclaim our home. Since then, we dwarves try to avoid the Elven King, not because we are afraid, mind you, but because we really don't like him. It's understandable and all, with him putting them to the dungeons without right cause. That pointy-eared, greedy, selfish. Legolas sighed through Gimli's list of insults and turned to him. You do realize that you may be insulting my king, do you not? Gimli grumbled. I am telling you as it is. I pity you if he is your king. You should move to Lothlorien. He smiled. Now that is a place to be. Legolas shook his head in amusement. Don't have I some obligation to defend my king? Gimli shook his head. For all we know, you ran away from Mirkwood to get away from his rule. I very much doubt that, my friend. I was much too young to know, understand, or even care about politics. He turned back to his arrows and continued to sharpen them. Well, take it from me, Legolas. King Thranduil isn't egoistic. I'm surprised you even know what that means. Legolas interrupted quietly, feeling very amused when Gimli continued to insult the king, as if he didn't hear the elf's mutter. Greedy, careless, the most headstrong and stupid, Gimli, Aragorn's voice called out. Both of them looked up and saw the man give Gimli a careful look. He walked over to them and sat on a barrel beside Legolas. Gimli happens to be very biased when it comes to elves, the Elven King and Mirkwood elves in particular. Legolas' lips twitched in amusement. I can see. Aragorn's eyes sparkled to show his own amusement, while Gimli grumbled again in annoyance. The Elven King isn't like that, Aragorn continued. Yes, he is a proud king, but he is extremely protective of his kingdom. One has to be with the threat of darkness consistently on his doorstep. You would be lucky to have him as your ruler. He is just careful and harsh as it could be, but just in his sentences. Although, he said before Gimli could interrupt, when it comes to dwarves, it is harder to see the line. He has little patience for them, as they have for him. Legolas turned back to Gimli. Worry not, my young friend. I doubt I will have much contact with the egoistic king, he said with his eyes sparkling with enjoyment. It had been such a long time since he had friends to talk to. It was a wonderful change from what he was used to. In the beginning, he had feared he wouldn't fit into the little group, but now he found himself jousting with them and enjoying himself immensely. Well, good lad. Can't have him corrupt you, Gimli said, keeping up with the humor. Yes, we can't have the Elven King corrupt me. The only thing worse then that would be a dwarf corrupting me, wouldn't it? Legolas joked. Hump! Gimli grumbled as he glared at the elf. Legolas and Aragorn chuckled. We'll see who corrupts who at the battle, Gimli challenged. Don't forget to keep count this time. Legolas shook his head. What is with the counting, my short, stoutly friend? Gimli shrugged his shoulders. It makes it more fun and interesting. You might as well humor him, Legolas. Aragorn interrupted. He'll keep count anyways, and we will forever hear of his deeds in battle, he joked. Legolas suddenly frowned and picked up his head at a distant sound. What is it, Legolas? Aragorn questioned seriously, the good mood evaporating quickly. The sound of battle, Legolas said, his ears picking up the clash of swords and the screams of the dying. He could almost taste the spilt blood in the air. The King of the Dead appeared before them. We will be there very shortly. Aragorn nodded. We should get into position. The King of the Dead nodded and disappeared again. Aragorn turned to them. Are you ready? He asked. Legolas placed his newly sharpened arrows back into his quiver and nodded. Aye, laddie, we're ready, Gimli said, his hand tightening his grip on his axe in anticipation. It wasn't long before the other two could hear the sound of the bloody battle. Chapter 10. The three of them knelt down against the wall of the ship, each of them clinching their weapons in anticipation as the fleet of black ships pulled up along the Anduin River by the city. Every one of them could now hear the clash of swords and the screams of the dying. Late, as usual, an orc yelled from the shore. Pirate scum! There's knife work that needs doing. Legolas and Gimli looked towards Aragorn for the signal. "Come on, you sea rats. Get out off your ships," the orc yelled. Aragorn glanced up at them. "You heard him," he whispered. Gimli smiled with glee, his hand tightening around his axe with eagerness. All three of them stood up and leapt out of the ships and onto land. The orcs stepped back, startled by their appearance, as the three started making with way to them, with Aragorn in the lead. The orcs smiled with their yellow and rotten teeth, amused at the small assault. "There are plenty for the both of us. May the best dwarf win," Gimli said. Legolas nodded without looking away from the orcs in front of them. Aragorn raised his blade and began running with a war cry upon his lips. Legolas and Gimli ran along with him. The army of the dead appeared, frightening the orcs. The army outran the three living beings and swept into the battle with unchallenged haste. Legolas made his first kill with a well-aimed arrow to the orc's head. 1. He couldn't believe he was actually going to count his kills. It was not something he had ever thought to do before, but Gimli was right. It sure did make the battle more interesting. He could hear Gimli counting under his breath, as well as they made their way deeper and deeper into the throng of orcs. Legolas pulled back his bow and shot another orc before quickly repeating the same motion. 15, 16, he counted. 17. He didn't stop nor pause. When he ran out of arrows, he would quickly grab a stray one from the ground or use his daggers. He was able to collect more arrows that way, restocking as the fight continued. 31, 32. "Legolas!" Aragorn called out. Legolas turned to him and saw Aragorn pointing to a large mumakil with a great platform and canvas war harness on its back, running straight for the elf. His eyes quickly calculated the best way to take it down as he rushed forward. The mumakil was swinging its tusks back and forth, knocking men far from their horses. As the mumakil swung its head, Legolas was able to grab onto the tusk and swing himself onto it. The large animal tried to knock him off with its trunk, but Legolas was much too swift. He jumped from the tusk to one of the many arrows sticking out of its legs. He was able to stay balanced despite the speed which the mumakil was walking. Legolas jumped to the back leg as soon as he got the chance and began climb up, using the arrows embedded in its leg. He made it to the top, standing on the back end of the animal. He grabbed his arrows and shot off the enemies in the platform. 33, 34. A man jumped out of the platform with a spear. Legolas shot him while he was still in the air. 35. Another man jumped out and came straight for him before Legolas was able to grab another arrow. He used his bow to block the attack, stumbling back before catching his balance again. The man went to pouch him, but Legolas grabbed his arm and flung him off the mumakil. The man fell with a scream. 36! Another man jumped towards him. Legolas quickly ducked out of the way, and the man fell down and rolled off the animal. Legolas reached one of the ropes on the harness and jumped off the side of the mumakil, pulling out one of his daggers. Several hundred feet above ground, Legolas hung there for a second before cutting the harnesses. Without the support, the platform slid off the opposite side of the animal. Legolas tightened his hold on the rope and allowed himself to be pulled back on the top of the mumakil before letting go. He balanced on the back of the mumakil and watched as the army of the dead crawled over the fallen platform on the ground, killing any possible survivors. Legolas turned back to the still-moving animal and pulled out 3 arrows as he walked to its head. He pulled back the string of his bow and let the 3 arrows fly straight into the head of the mumakil, killing it almost instantly. As the animal fell forward, Legolas surfed down its trunk, landing gracefully on the ground in front of a grudgingly impressed dwarf. That still only counts as one, Gimli snapped. Legolas just shook his head and went right back to fighting. With the army of the dead on their side, wasn't long before the battle ended. The dead had swept across the battlefield and slaughtered the orcs. Unmatched and with a fierce easiness, Legolas placed his bow on his back and glanced around. Whatever orcs were left was quickly taken care of. He frowned at the number of lifeless bodies that scattered the ground, mumakals, orcs, and men alike. The ground was covered with the black blood of the orcs and the red blood of men. Forgotten, abandoned, and broken shields, spears, swords, and arrows littered the ground. Legolas could smell the stench of death in the air. Expressionlessly, his eyes flickered across them carelessly until he saw Aragorn. The man was walking over the bodies, his expression troubled, but guarded as he made his way to Gandalf and Pippin. "We might as well," Gimli said, appearing next to him. Legolas glanced down at him. Gimli was watching Aragorn as well. The dwarf started walking over. Legolas followed. By the time they reached Aragorn, the King of the Dead stood before him. "Release us!" the King of the Dead demanded. "Bad idea," Gimli interrupted. "Very handy in a tight spot, these lads, despite the fact they're dead." The King of the Dead glanced in at Gimli, almost looking panicked at the idea. He snapped his gaze back to the silent man before him. "You gave us your word," he snapped. Legolas could sense the raising panic inside the dead army. Aragorn gave him a respectful nod. "I hold your oath filled. Go, be at peace." A breeze swept through, and the King of the Dead smiled, suddenly looking more whole as he disappeared, his army following close behind him. Aragorn turned to face them, and Gandalf bowed his head to him, the new king of Gondor. Pippin saw Gandalf bowing, and quickly followed suit. Gimli bowed his head as well, and Legolas gave him a nod of recognition. The new king winced at the respect display of his friends. "What is your first act as king?" Gandalf asked. Aragorn frowned and glanced around the battlefield. Éomer came up beside him to await orders. "Look for the wounded and take them inside to be tended. Carry the dead to one side for proper burial and burn the carcasses of the enemies. I want no trace of them left on this land." Éomer nodded and headed off to spread the orders to the survivors. Pippin quickly followed Éomer, anxious to help before anyone could tell him otherwise. Aragorn turned to Gandalf. "Gandalf, would you help make room for all the wounded in the houses of healing?" Gandalf nodded. "You'll be a wise king. Do not fear." He turned and headed off to the city without another word. Legolas and Gimli approached Aragorn. "It will take several days to clean this up," the elf said, eyeing the bloody field. He turned back to Aragorn. "How are you feeling being king?" "I am not king yet." Aragorn paused. "But I can't avoid it any longer." Without answering Legolas's question, he left, stepping over bodies to help look for survivors. Legolas and Gimli watch him go. He's been trying to avoid it for so long, but he can no longer, Gimli said. "I do not envy him." He turned to Legolas with his eyes narrowed. "Your count, elf?" Legolas sighed. 54. He raised a brow, waiting for Gimli's count, which was lower than his by the look on the dwarf's face. Gimli glared and grumbled something under his breath. Legolas continued to wait in silence, and Gimli reluctantly shared his number. 49, he growled. He walked off quickly before Legolas could say anything. The elf just shook his head in faint amusement. Legolas's face remained expressionless as he walked over the dead bodies. His eyes scanned each one, looking for any signs of life. "Legolas! Legolas!" Pippin called to him, panicked and worried. The elf paused and turned to face the little hobbit. Pippin ran to him, holding a cloak. He had worried tears in his eyes as he held out the cloak. "It's Merry's. Have you seen him? Would you help me look?" he asked frantically. Legolas took the cloak from Pippin's shaky hands and placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him. He nodded. "Of course, my little friend. Merry is a strong and brave hobbit. We'll find him soon enough. Where did you discover the cloak?" Pippin led him to the spot. The bodies of orcs were scattered around the place, just like any other place. A body or two of the Rohirrim soldiers were nearby, and a few fallen horses. But Legolas could see any hobbit-sized figures on the ground. He scanned the ground all around with his sharp, elvish eyes. Pippin stood close to him, his eyes burning with hope. "Do you see him?" he asked. "I do not, but don't be discouraged, Pippin," Legolas said before the hobbit could grieve. "That could just mean he is alive, or someone could have already taken him to the Halls of Healing." He laid a hand on Pippin's shoulder. "I promise I shall keep an eye open for him and inform Aragorn." He gave the shoulder a comforting squeeze. "Do not lose your hope, my young friend. We'll find him." Pippin gave him a shaky smile and an uncertain nodded. "Yes." His smile and nod grew more confident, and he said with his newfound confidence, "Yes, you're right. We'll find him." The search for survivors lasted the rest of the day and well into the night. Legolas was supporting a man into the Halls of Healing. The man's arm was crushed, having been stepped on by one of the Mumakals. It was an unpleasant sight to see. It would never heal, he knew. The healers, he was sure, would amputate it. There was nothing else they would be able to do. The man was in such pain, he was barely aware of anything around him. When Legolas left the battlefield, there were only a few hopeful men still looking for friends or their kin. It didn't escape his notice that Pippin was still wandering around. He set the man down on an empty cot in the hall. Things had gotten quiet, as those who were able to rest were resting, and hopeful souls were sitting by their loved one's side. Healers were walking among them, helping who they can, when they can. There were so few of them. Some of the more experienced warriors were helping the healers. Legolas saw Aragorn by Lady Eowyn's side, along with her brother. He turned from the sight and headed back out. With his elvish resilience, Legolas knew he stood a better chance of getting to any survivors before his own body grew too weary. He was out there for another half an hour before he heard Pippin call out his name with great urgency. "Legolas! It's Merry! Legolas, come! Quick!" He could see Pippin standing in the distance between the feet of a fallen Mumakil. He swiftly made his way over. Pippin knelt back down to a barely conscious figure when Legolas approached. He knelt down and quickly scanned Merry's body for injury. He had a bump on his head, a bloody nose, a bruise forming around his eye, a small wound on his arm that bled lightly. The only thing that would cause him any real concern was the bump on the head. It could explain Merry's unconscious state. "Will he be all right?" Pippin asked anxiously, his hand holding Merry's in a tight grip. Legolas nodded. "He will live." Pippin let out a sigh of relief. "Let's get him to the Halls of Healing." Legolas reached down and picked Merry up with ease. Pippin trailed after him as he made his way back into the city. After finding all the survivors, the next few days consisted of burning the corpses of the enemy and cleaning the battlefield of the fallen weapons and shields. The few days after that was the burials and honoring the dead. Theoden, King of Rohan, was wrapped to be preserved for the return home, to be buried with his kin in the family's royal tomb. Legolas, once again, hardened himself in the face of the grieving people. Why must elves feel so much for death? He had wondered. Even elves who grew up around men feel it so personally. After the last soul was put to rest, came the slow rebuilding of the proud city. The one bright spot in that trying week and a half was the discovery of Aerod and Brago. The loyal steeds had found their way to their master's side once again. It lightened Legolas's heart to see the horse that went through much with him. Over a week after the battle, a small council formed in the throne room with Gandalf, Aragorn, Gimli, Legolas, and Éomer. Faramir, the new steward of Gondor, should have been a part of the meeting, but he was still recovering from his own injuries. It didn't pass anyone's notice that he was spending quite a bit of time with Éomer's sister Éowyn. The throne room was almost completely white and silver, with a few places that were black marble. Gimli sat on the throne chair reserved for the steward with a pipe, while everyone else stood. Legolas and Éomer stood on one side, completely still, as Gandalf paced. Aragorn had his arms folded and his back to them as they talked. "What is our next course of action?" Éomer asked. "Do we know how the ring-bearer fares?" Legolas asked. "Has he made it to Mordor?" Almost everyone in the room looked towards Gandalf for the answer. The wizard took a moment to think. He was last seen by Faramir in Osgiliath. I was informed by him that Frodo was heading to Cirith Ungol, the pass through the western mountains of Mordor. Beyond that, I know no more. A disheartening pause. "Frodo has passed beyond my sight," he admitted. "The darkness is deepening." Legolas nodded in agreement, having have felt the deepening darkness. It was like black paint. The first swipe of paint appeared to be gray, but the more one swiped it, the darker and thicker it would get. If Sauron had the ring, we would know it. Aragorn spoke up for the first time since the meeting started. Gandalf shook his head. "It's only a matter of time. He has suffered a defeat, yes, but behind the walls of Mordor, our enemy is regrouping. What are we going to do about it?" Legolas asked. Gimli puffed his pipe. "What are we going to do? Let's let him stay there and rot. Why should we care?" Gandalf rounded on him. "Because 10,000 orcs now stand between Frodo and Mount Doom." "Oh," Gimli muttered, looking chastened. Gandalf didn't seem to notice. His face gazed, looking years older. "I've sent him to his death," he said, with heavy, guilty responsibility. Aragorn turned to face them and shook his head at Gandalf. "No," he said simply. "There's still hope for Frodo. He needs time and safe passage across the plains of Gorgoroth. We can give him that." Legolas blinked in question as Gimli voiced it. "How?" "Draw out Sauron's armies," Aragorn answered. "Empty his lands. Then we gather our full strength and march on the Black Gate." Éomer stepped forward. "We cannot achieve victory through strength of arms," he pointed out. Aragorn looked at him and shook his head. "Not for ourselves." He moved his gaze to each and every one of them. "But we can give Frodo his chance if we keep Sauron's eye fixed upon us, keep him blind to all else that moves." Legolas lifted his eyes up in realization. A diversion, he thought to himself. He couldn't help but admire Aragorn's thinking. A simple but effective plan, if it worked. Certainty of death. Small chance of success. "What are we waiting for?" Gimli said with his agreement to the plan. Legolas watched Gandalf step close to Aragorn and whispered to him, "Sauron will suspect a trap. He will not take the bait." Aragorn grinned grimly. "He will." He turned to Éomer. "Have the army be ready in 3 days' time. Whoever is able to fight and willing." "What are you planning, Aragorn?" Gandalf asked. Aragorn glanced back at him. I am going to tell Sauron just who is coming to his door." Captain Irinian spoke quietly with Lolandir in the large, dome-like throne room about the amount of elves stationed around the borders when one of their scouts came rushing into the room, bypassing proper protocols. Captain Irinian felt his heart race, knowing that the scout would barge in only with the strictest of news. "What is it, Lenway?" he demanded. Lenway breathed in heavily, his eyes wide with what he had seen. "It is as we feared, Captain. An army is heading our way. They would be here by midday tomorrow." Captain Irinian's spine straightened with attention at the news. Lolandir gasped and stood. "How many?" "No more than 1,000. They aren't coming from Dol Guldur, Captain, Advisor. They are coming from the east." "The east?" Captain Irinian gasped out. The orcs leaving the forest, he realized, weren't going to Rohan or Gondor or Mordor. They were going around the forest to attack them from the side. A sneak attack. Lenwyn nodded. "We would not have seen them if the eastern trees hadn't whispered of danger." Captain Irinian frowned in thought. "Captain?" Lolandir questioned when he saw the frown. "What troubles you?" "Only 1,000?" Captain Irinian asked the scout, momentarily ignoring Lolandir. Lenwyn nodded. "Yes, Captain." Captain Irinian turned back to Lolandir. "That is not much, less than I anticipated." "Is that not a good thing, Captain?" Lolandir asked. "I fear it's not. There were a lot more orcs in Dol Guldur than a mere 1,000. Where are the rest of them?" Captain Irinian, another scout, Elaros, entered the room and bowed respectfully. Elaros, much to his friends' and comrades' relief, had managed to overcome his spider bite in a few days' time. He made a full recovery in such a short time and went willingly back to his job as a scout. "Do you have news, Elaros?" Lolandir asked before Captain Irinian could. "I am afraid so, Advisor Lolandir. An army of 2,000 is approaching the kingdom from the south." There was a stillness in the throne room before Lolandir took control. Captain Irinian, ready the warriors for battle. "Let's not let our king and prince return to a ruined kingdom." "Understood?" Captain Irinian nodded. "Completely." Aragorn was leading an army from Minas Tirith. He was dressed in his heritage, with the symbol of the white tree upon his chest. He looked stern and determined as the host marched out from the main city of Gondor towards Mordor. There was silence in the party as the horses trod down the path towards the river. Beyond the river lay the smoky tips of Mordor. It would take several days to travel to the Black Gate, but Aragorn seemed determined to make each step matter. Legolas clenched his teeth with determination. He had been hesitant to follow them to the Black Gates. There was even a smaller chance of survival, and the pull towards Mirkwood grew strong and heavy in his mind. But he had made a promise, and he was not an elf to break a promise. He would see this to the end before going to the place he believed held answers to who he was and his kin. Some distance away, traveling from another direction, another group determinedly marched towards the Black Gates, their pace hard and barely with any rest, their energy fueled by hope of finding their lost prince. The Brownlands were harsh, but their determination was harsher. They would not give up or surrender. The mighty elves of the Greenwood realm stayed by their king's side as he led them across the wasted plains. King Thranduil eyes narrowed at the smoke in the sky, rising from Mordor. He had never felt such hope in him in some time, and he fueled himself with it just as much as his warriors did. He would not live with such disappointment if Legolas no longer traveled with Lord Aragorn. He glanced back up at the smoke from Mordor. He would do anything to bring his son back to him. Anything. Chapter 11. Legolas could feel the rise in tension the moment the Black Gate came within sight. Even the horses seemed to flinch. The darkness in the area was much stronger here. It was almost hard to breathe. They were standing in the center of the black paint spot, the blackest and thickest part. Legolas urged Arad to move towards Aragorn's side. They don't appear to be waiting for us, he noted quietly. Maybe someone should knock, Gimli said from Legolas, having, for the first time, decided to ride with the elf instead of with Aragorn. Remind them of our meeting. Aragorn stopped Brago and held up his hand for everyone else to stop. His gray eyes eyed the black gate. No, they're waiting, he said confidently. Where are they? Pippin asked from Shadowfax, not having heard the conversation between Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. Aragorn spurred his horse towards the gate. Éomer, Gandalf, and Legolas urged their horses forward to follow him. The King of Men stared up at the looming and begrimed doors of the gate. Let the Lord of the Black Land come forth. Let justice be done upon him, he shouted up at the gate. There was a loud creaking sound as the door cracked open. Everyone tensed up, and Legolas caught the whiff of ash and death coming from the cracked door. He controlled his urge to flinch as a single rider appeared upon a dark horse. The only part of the rider they could see was a grotesque mouth with rotten yellow and black jagged teeth. The rest of him was covered with mental armor and a black cloak. It was a very unpleasant sight. My master, Sauron the Great, bids you welcome, it said. Is there any in this rout with the authority to treat with me? He seemed to grin, but Legolas couldn't tell. We do not come to treat with Sauron, faithless and accursed. Gandalf injected with narrowed eyes. Tell your master this. The armies of Mordor must disband. He is to depart these lands, never to return. The creature turned his head towards Gandalf. Old Greybarad, I have a token I was bidden to show thee. It held up a white shirt of mithril. It was shirt of well-done quality, expensive and elegantly woven. A beautiful shirt. It meant nothing to Legolas, but it had a disheartening effect on his companions. Everyone else had sucked in a breath at the sight, and Pippin let out a quiet, sorrowful moan. Frodo. The creature threw the mithril shirt to Gandalf, who caught it. He stared at it before quietly passing it to Pippin. Frodo, Pippin said, louder with horror. Frodo, the name of the ring-bearer. Legolas's eyes widened before narrowing. As Aragorn had said earlier, if Sauron had the ring, they would have known it. He would not have bothered with greeting them at his gate. There would have been a flourish of activity going on inside, and his army would have been pouring out of Mordor to spread his poison. Silence, Gandalf snapped at Pippin. No! Merry moaned from behind Éomer. Gandalf glared at him, but it was too late. The creature now knew the news pained them, and took delightful pleasure in it. The halfling was dear to thee, I see. Know that he suffered greatly at the hands of his host. Who would have thought one so small could endure so much pain? And he did, Gandalf. He did. He started to laugh wickedly, enjoying Gandalf's barely hidden guilt. As he started to laugh, Aragorn rode casually towards him until he was at his side. The creature stared at him and cocked his head to the side. And who is this? Isildur's heir? It takes more to make a king than a broken elvish blade. Aragorn didn't grace him with a verbal response, but Legolas, with his sharp eyes, could see his hand going towards the hilt of his sword. With a quick, hard slice, Aragorn cut the creature's head with his suddenly drawn sword. The body sat there on top of the horse for a second, before tilting over and falling off. I guess that concludes negotiations, Gimli grumbled from behind Legolas. Aragorn turned to his stunned audience. I do not believe it. I will not, he said, with conviction. Legolas nodded in agreement. Frodo is alive, Aragorn continued to say. I know he is. There is still hope. Just as he finished speaking, they heard a loud creak from the black gate. Everyone turned to it as he swayed open, revealing an army of marching orcs. Barad-dûr loomed in the background, its eye now staring at Aragorn. Aragorn urged his horse back. "Pull back! Pull back!" he yelled at them. They quickly turned and rushed back to the awaiting army of men as the orcs poured out of the Black Gate. Legolas watched as the much larger army marched out of the Black Gate. Arod stepped back, unsettled. "Shh, my friend, shh." Legolas reached down and petted the horse's neck to soothe his fear. "Hold your ground." Aragorn shouted to the army, "Hold your ground." Legolas turned his gaze to the new king of Gondor. The man was facing the army of men, sons of Gondor, of Rohan, my brothers. I see in your eyes the same fear that would take the heart of me. He walked his horse down the line of men, still speaking. A day may come when the courage of men fails, when we forsake our friends and break all bond of fellowship. But it is not this day. An hour of wolves and shattered shields when the age of men comes crashing down. But it is not this day. This day we fight, he yelled. By all that you hold dear on this good earth, I bid you stand, men of the West. He held up his sword in encouragement, and the soldiers drew their swords with agreement. As the orc masses began to encircle the army of men, Aragorn dismounted his horse. Legolas, Gandalf, and Éomer followed his lead. Aragorn glanced at Legolas. This is no place for horses. Legolas, would you care for them? Legolas nodded and took the rein of the other horses, speaking Elvish to them. Go, friends, he said quietly as he petted their necks. Be safe. Arad touched his forehead to Legolas in a silent agreement before racing off, the other horses following. He turned back to Aragorn and nodded. The man nodded in return with gratitude before facing the orc army. In a few minutes, they were completely encircled by the orcs and vastly outnumbered. The air seemed to crackle with anticipation and tension. Well, my friend, Gimli said by beside Legolas, you ever thought you'll die next to a dwarf? Legolas cracked a smile at him and shook his head. No, but I have thought it would be wonderful to die side by side with a friend. Gimli returned the smile and nodded. Aye, it's a noble way to go, do you think? Legolas nodded as well. Yes, it certainly is, my friend. It certainly is. Are you ready? Gimli nodded. But of course. They were interrupted by Aragorn taking a step forward, lowering his sword as he did so. He was looking at the eye intently, almost like he was locked in some spell. Legolas narrowed his eyes in confusion to such action. Aragorn stopped and turned back to address Gandalf. For Frodo, he said serenely. He turned back to the orc army. Waving his sword, he started running towards them, yelling a fierce battle cry. There was a second of shock before Merry and Pippin ran out, calling out a cry as well. Legolas' lips twitched and he shook his head. The bravery of hobbits, astounding. He glanced down at Gimli, and the dwarf chuckled in agreement before racing out. Legolas by his side, and the rest of the army close behind them. The army soon clashed with the orcs, and the battle began. At some point during the fight, Legolas lost his sword and had to resort to using his arrows and daggers. Orcs were all around them. With speed of an elf, Legolas shot one orc after another, but he knew he would run out of arrows eventually. Everywhere he looked, the men were getting slaughtered. Each orc killed seemed to get replaced by two more. He had lost track of his companions, and he struggled to find them. Legolas saw Aragorn briefly before two orcs blocked his path. Legolas ducked as an orc swung his sword at him. He whipped out one of his daggers and stabbed him in the gut as the other orc made a move to stab him. Legolas rolled away and kicked out its feet from under it. The creature landed painfully on its back, and Legolas cut its throat. He glanced over and was still able to see Aragorn. The man was fight off 3 orcs, but didn't seem to see the orcs sneaking up behind him. "Aragorn!" Legolas yelled, but the noise of the fighting around them drowned out the sound. Legolas quickly reached up and took one of his last arrows. Just before the orc was able to stab Aragorn in the back, Legolas released his arrow, and it made its target, right in the head. Aragorn spun and saw the body, looking up and giving Legolas a quick, thankful nod. Legolas quickly made his way over to him, fighting off orcs as he went. "Where are the others?" he asked him as he used his bow to block an attack from an orc. Aragorn stabbed him and shook his head. "I lost them. The hobbits were with..." He was interrupted by a loud horn. Everyone seemed to stop fighting, confused. "Reinforcements?" Legolas questioned. Aragorn shook his head. "From where?" he asked rhetorically. The horn sounded again, coming from the hill behind them. Legolas and Aragorn turned their attention to the hill, along with everyone else. A figure appeared from on top of a white steed. Legolas's sharp eyes were able to see the figure's stern expression, his pointy ears. There was a hardness about him and a calm determination. This was an elf that had been through much hardship in life and knew what to expect from a battle. There was something about the elf's face that sparked something inside Legolas, a comfort. Despite his sternness, this elf brought strength within him. From behind the figure, more horses appeared, more elves on top of them. "More elves from Lothlorien?" Legolas asked. Aragorn shook his head, his eyes not leaving the elves. "Number that is King Thranduil of Mirkwood," he said in astonishment. Legolas snapped his eyes to him in surprise. "Mirkwood?" He turned his gaze back at the elven warriors, his kin. He turned his sight back to the king. King Thranduil, his king? Why was the king of the Greenwood realm here? How did he know? He had to have known weeks in advance of this battle. But how was that possible? Why would he come? Did he not have his own battles to fight in Mirkwood? Legolas could now understand why Gimli called him prideful, for he looked mightily proud at that moment. Sitting tall on the back of his white horse, the king gracefully got off his horse and stared with unforgiving eyes at the battlefield before him. He raised his arms and made a fist. In unison, the warriors got off their horses and pulled out their swords, their expression equally as unforgiving. It wasn't just the king that had seen and been through much in his life. The warriors had that same hardness about them, embedded from living in the dark place of Mirkwood. The king pulled out his own sword and said something to his warriors, but he was too far for Legolas's elf ears to hear. The orcs braced themselves to fight the elves. They did not seem too concerned about this new addition to the battle. They had no reason to be. They still far outnumbered them. King Thranduil shouted, "See!" And the elves started running down the hill with their swords raised, the king leading the charge. Now, Aragorn took advantage of the distraction to slash at an unexpected orc. Legolas and many others quickly took his lead, and the fighting began again. Soon, elves were mingled in with the men and orcs. Legolas found himself often enough fighting alongside his kin. It was different than Helm's Deep. Those elves were from Lothlorien. These ones were from Mirkwood, his home. Each elf he came across, he couldn't help but wonder if he could be family or know of his family. The battle was barely interrupted by the sudden loud shrieking of the Nazgul as they flew in from Mordor. One of the Nazgul swooped down and picked up several men and elves and threw them into the air. Legolas ducked as another Nazgul swooped right over his head. The claws gazed his hair, letting him know just how close he was to being thrown. An orc tried to take advantage of his distraction, but Legolas was able to block the blow with his dagger. He kicked the orc back in the gut and quickly slashed its throat. He paused when he heard the distant call of birds. He glanced up briefly to see several eagles appear and attack the Nazgul. "Eagles!" a voice yelled in excitement. "The eagles are coming!" Legolas recognized the voice to belong to Pippin and sighed in relief, knowing at least Pippin was all right. Legolas saw an orc running towards him and quickly threw one of his daggers at him, and it penetrated its forehead. He heard a roar of a troll and quickly turned, just in time to see a huge troll knock the king of Mirkwood clear off his feet. The king went down with a thud, and his sword flew from his hand, landing far from his reach. The troll headed over to him. King Thranduil crawled back to get away, but the boulder behind him kept him from going too far. The king's face was set, not showing any fear or uncertainty as the troll made its way to him. Legolas's eyes widened, knowing it was his duty, as an elf of Mirkwood, to protect the king. He reached behind him to grab an arrow, but his hand only felt air. He quickly took off the quiver and looked. Nothing. It almost felt like his heart stopped for a moment. He glanced over at the situation. The troll was still walking towards the trapped king. There was no way Legolas could make it over to come to his defense. He was out of arrow. He paused. No. He wasn't out of arrows. He glanced down to where his hidden pouch was located in his quiver. He had one last arrow. Without thinking how much he would miss his precious arrow, he ripped open the pouch, and there it was, the arrow that he had with him since before he could remember. It was still in good condition. It was one of the most precious items he owned. He wanted to keep it in great condition. He glanced back at the situation. The troll raised its sword to smite the mighty king down. Without another thought, Legolas knocked the arrow into his bow and pulled back the string. He took aim and released it. The arrow sailed with clear precision, and it struck the troll through the head. The troll slowly fell backwards and hit the ground with a loud thump that shook the ground. The king slowly raised his eyes to him, and their eyes connected. King Thranduil had found himself fighting by the edge of the battle. He was just up against an orc when a huge shadow blocked what little light there were. He forgot all about the orc as he turned and faced the new threat. The troll had smacked him in the stomach so hard he flew back. The breath was knocked out of him when his back slammed to the ground and his sword left his hand. He kept his face expressionless, hiding the spark of fear as the troll came towards him. When that troll raised his sword, the only thought Thranduil had was of his son, how he would not be able to see his son again, hold him, tell him how much he meant to him. He was so close to seeing his son, only to die now. He had prepared himself to die when an arrow came seemingly out of nowhere and penetrated into the troll's head. He glanced to find the owner of that arrow and was met with stunning blue eyes of an oddly familiar elf. His heart seemed to stop as his brain caught up with his eyes. Standing tall, looking healthy, the elf slowly lowered his bow. He tilted his head slightly to the side, and his eyes narrowed, as if trying to place his face. Thranduil's heart seemed to jump into his throat at the motion. It reminded him so much of Tawariel. The elf was quickly distracted by an orc heading his way, but Thranduil could only continue to stare. "Legolas," he whispered in wonderment. He watched as his long-lost son fought off the orc with a single dagger. He moved swiftly and gracefully as he dodged the swings of the orc's blade. He felt a rush of pride. His son had become a mighty warrior, strong and independent. Thranduil's sight of his son was quickly blocked by the ongoing battle. His heart skipped a beat the moment he couldn't see Legolas. He jumped to his feet, needing to see him again. His nerves went wild with fear for his son's life. "Legolas!" he shouted instinctually as he tried to push his way through the battle to the spot he last saw his son. Legolas. Seeing their king without a weapon, many of his warriors rushed to his protection, but their protection blocked him even more from getting to where he last saw Legolas. He pushed and shoved his way to the spot his son had stood, but by the time he got there, Legolas was nowhere to be seen. He glanced around, frantic to find him again. All he saw were elves and men fighting off orcs and trolls. "My king, take the sword!" an elf demanding, holding out the weapon. His face was dirty from the dirt being kicked about, and his clothing dark with a stain of orc blood. The sight brought Thranduil back to the present situation, knowing he looked no better and neither would his son. Thranduil blinked off his disappointment and grabbed the sword. "My son is here. Find him. Protect him," he ordered. Before the elf can acknowledge the order, an orc came running at them, and Thranduil found him thrust back into the speed of the battle. He didn't wait for the acknowledgement. He knew his warrior would do as he was told. Legolas felt the moment the eye of Sauron turned its sight away from the battle. Its heat and darkened gaze had left him the moment of the eye's distraction. He and many others had looked up when the surviving Nazgul screeched and flew towards Mount Doom. Legolas felt trouble in his heart, knowing something must have sent them towards the mountain, and there was only one thing that would: the ring. The end was soon near. Whether or not it was the end of Sauron or the free people of Middle-earth was not yet seen. Legolas turned back to the battle, fighting furiously with a single dagger. He could see the exhaustion in the eyes of the men, but he could also see determination. He couldn't let those willing to fight down by not doing his part to the fullest of his ability. He was up against a rather repugnant orc when he lost his other dagger. The orc swung his sword at Legolas, and the elf was pressed to using his dagger to block the attack. But the momentum of the heavier weapon against the small one forced the dagger out of Legolas's hand. Legolas grinded his teeth in frustration as the orc chucked gleefully, taking in the empty quiver and lack of a sword on his person. The orc crooked his head to the side and grinned, showing Legolas his darkened, rotten, yellowed teeth. "No weapon, huh? How fortunate," he cooed as he stepped closer to Legolas, holding up his sword to strike. Legolas waited until the sword was well above the orc's head before sneering back at him. "I am never without a weapon, orc." He reached into his tunic and pulled out the smaller dagger he kept on his person at all times. With the orc's chest wide open for attack, Legolas lugged the dagger into the orc's blackened heart. The orc's eyes widened in surprise and pain as he made a choking sound. Legolas twisted the dagger before pulling it out, and the orc fell to the ground, motionlessly. Legolas turned just in time to block another attack and smite down the orc. He glanced around for another attack, but was distracted by the sight of Aragorn getting knocked to the ground by a large troll. "Aragorn!" he yelled pointlessly. He tried to push his way to the future king's rescue. He struggled through the bodies of men, elves, and orcs, trying desperately to make it to Aragorn. He saw Aragorn trying to crawl away as the troll stomped over to him, ready with its huge sword. Legolas barely saw the orc coming straight at him. His focus was purely on getting to Aragorn. Before he knew it, an elf jumped in front of him, and the oncoming orc, blocking the orc's weapon with his own. "Go," the elf ordered him as he blocked another attack. Confused, but not needing to be told twice, Legolas stepped around them and continued to rush towards Aragorn's side. Legolas pushed an elf out of the way, not caring he was not an orc. Friend or foe, he would push, trying to get to Aragorn and help. He saw the troll step on Aragorn's chest and felt a wave of panic enter into his heart. "No!" he yelled as he struggled harder to get to his friend. The troll raised his sword and was about to kill the man when the Eye of Sauron let out a piercing cry, stopping the whole battle. Sauron's army and the elves and men looked back to Mordor. Legolas watched with wide eyes as the fiery eye seemed to twitch like it was in pain. Sauron's troops started to flee, pushing and shoving to frantically get away. The men and elves let them, watching with confusion or wonder as the Tower of Barad-dûr slowly crumbled. The Eye of Sauron disappeared, letting loose a great shockwave. Legolas steadied himself before turning back to the tower. The pieces now littered the ground. He felt his heart burst with realization. It was over. The ring had been destroyed. The little hobbit known as Frodo had completed his mission. Legolas could already feel the darkness slowly getting smothered by a lightness from the Free People. All around him, people began cheering, realizing what he had realized. It was over. He smiled as thoughts of home entered him. It was over. He could go to Mirkwood now, without the guilt of leaving his friends in battle. He grew impatient to leave. He frowned when he felt the ground beneath him shake. The surrounding landscape began to crumble in Mordor, as if nature was cleaning out the dark ink of evil from its lands. The Black Gate collapsed as the ground caved in, taking much of Sauron's army as well. "Frodo!" Legolas heard Merry yell out in victory from somewhere behind him. "Frodo!" Men all around yelled out with him, glad of their victorious win. But it was then that Mount Doom erupted in a large explosion. The red, hot lava poured out, and dark, blackened smoke filled the sky. It killed the remaining Nazgûl, taking them down with lava rocks. It was a large explosion. Legolas's heart stopped for the hobbit he was sure was there. He frowned in sadness for the possible loss of life. Having never personally met the young hobbit, he couldn't mourn his passing like that of his friends. He turned when he felt someone brush past him. It was Aragorn, heading towards Gandalf, near the front of the army with great haste. Legolas quickly followed him, pushing himself past the men and elves. Aragorn had just made it to Gandalf when Legolas came to his side. Gandalf glanced at both of them. "I refuse to believe." He simply said, "I will gather the eagles and search for hope. Frodo and Sam would be found," he promised. "I'll bring them straight to Minas Tirith." Legolas briefly wondered who Sam was, for this was not the first time he heard that name, but knew this wasn't the time to ask. Aragorn nodded. "I'll start the move back towards Minas Tirith then." Gandalf nodded in agreement and left to call down the eagles. Aragorn turned to Legolas. "Will you?" He didn't get the question out. He took one look at Legolas's determined face and let the question drop. "You're leaving now," he stated. Legolas nodded. "I've waited long enough, my friend. I've been away from home long enough. It's time to return and discover who I am." Aragorn looked back at the waiting army, looking at the elves that were among them. Most of the men and elves were congratulating each other and checking for the injured and dead. Mixed feelings were high in the air, joy at the end of darkness and sorrow at the loss of life. He turned back to Legolas. "The army of Mirkwood is here now," he pointed out unnecessarily. Legolas nodded. "I know, but I can't wait. They would be going to Minas Tirith with you to recover and gather supplies for the return trip home." He shook his head. "I cannot wait any longer." "You would need supplies as well," Aragorn said. Legolas gave him a humorless grin. "I've been on my own for many years now. I will live without getting supplies at Minas Tirith. I shall be fine." Aragorn shook his head. "I had promised to go with you and help you discover your family." Legolas nodded. "I know, and that makes you one of my greatest friends. However, you have responsibilities as leader and king to the people of Gondor. You are needed here. You're leaving already? A gruff voice asked from behind him. Legolas grinned and turned, facing Gimli. He nodded. Yes, my stout friend. But worry not. I wouldn't leave without a goodbye. It's time I go. Gimli shifted his feet almost uncomfortably. Well, I don't see this as a goodbye. Just until we see each other again. Legolas smiled and nodded. Aye, Nalu Egovendvin. Until next we meet. I would like to know the heath of your young hobbit friend. Gimli grinned. Well, you better come back, so I will be able to tell you of Frodo's health, and you will need to tell me of your success, or lack of success, he added with a grin. Legolas chuckled and nodded. I shall. He turned back to the man. Aragorn nodded and grasped Legolas's forearm. You will always have a home in Gondor, Legolas. You are always welcomed. Galu. Good luck, Gurin Glasui. Legolas turned and left, making sure to whistle for Arod. He was out of sight of Mordor quickly. Thank you from my heart. King Thranduil had once again found himself at the edge of the battle the moment the eye was destroyed. After a moment of pure relief, he started to push towards the front, looking for either Lord Aragorn, Gandalf, or, more particularly, Legolas. It took time and effort to make his way to the front, where he located Lord Aragorn with a dwarf. He disregarded the dwarf completely and made his way straight towards the man. Aragorn glanced up at his coming. King Thranduil, I would like to thank you for... Where is he? Thranduil demanded impatiently. He glared at the man in front of him. Aragorn blinked. Pardon? Where is my son? Thranduil said in a low tone, trying to keep himself controlled and calm. The man's eyes blinked, then widened in realization. The Pelennor lies silent now, its echoes fading into the wind. Close your eyes, dear friend. The tale has not yet ended, and when you return, we will face the Black Gate together.